Step into Regency, England, in a world of quiet longing, family duty, whispered scandal, and unexpected love. Every story offers another journey into romance. So settle in, dear listener, and let this Regency Romance audiobook carry you into a time of elegance, emotion, and romance. The story begins now. Chapter 1. The Notice. Half Moon Street, London, May 1814. The notice had been on the desk for 3 days before Lady Iris Bellamy took up her pen and finished it. The room was the morning room of the house in Half Moon Street, which had been her husband's house first and was now hers. The fire had burned low, leaving a narrow glow between the coals. The book Henry had been reading the week he fell ill still lay face down on the table beside his chair, open at the page where he had stopped. Lady Iris had not moved it. She had told the maid not to move it. 16 months had passed, and the page had grown a little yellow at the edge. The chair had been dusted and shifted and put back 100 times, but to Iris it remained Henry's chair, drawn close to the hearth, waiting for him to return to it. Lady Iris dipped the pen and wrote,
"A widow of modest establishment, lately bereaved, seeks the companionship of a lady of education and quiet disposition for several months' travel to Bath and other parts of England. References required. Apply by letter to Mrs. Bellamy, number 18, Half Moon Street, Piccadilly."
She read it through once. Then she read it again, more slowly. At last she set the pen down. A knock came at the door, and her sister-in-law walked in before the maid could announce her. Lady Sophronia, who had been married to Henry's elder brother, and who took the matter of the family name more seriously than anyone now living in it, sat down without waiting to be asked.
"Lady Iris,"
Lady Sophronia said,
"I have come about the matter of the season."
"Then you have come in vain, Sophronia. I do not mean to take part in it."
"So I understand. Francis wrote to me yesterday, greatly alarmed by your determination to be singular."
"How tiresome of Francis."
"Tiresome perhaps, but not mistaken. I have come to save you from becoming a subject of conversation."
Lady Sophronia sat down in Henry's chair, which Lady Iris had not invited her to do, and arranged her gloves upon her lap. She was a tall woman who looked taller sitting down, and she wore a great deal of dark grey, with a jet brooch fastened at her throat as if it had been placed there to keep her opinions from escaping too quickly.
"You cannot mean to spend another year shut up in this house."
"On the contrary, Sophronia, I am going to Bath."
"Bath?
Lady Sophronia repeated, as though the word required an apology.
Alone?
"I mean to take a companion."
A companion? What companion?"
"At present an imaginary one. I am composing the notice now."
Lady Sophronia turned her head and looked at the paper on the desk. She had the sort of eyesight that could read a letter from across a room, and the sort of character that made the talent a public danger.
"Lady Iris,"
Lady Sophronia said,
"I cannot pretend to understand what has come over you, but I will say plainly that 16 months is mourning enough for any woman who does not mean to make a profession of grief. No one expects gaiety from you, but London will not know what to make of a young widow who refuses every proper invitation, engages a paid companion, and sets off about the country as though she had neither relations nor duties."
"London,"
Lady Iris said,
"has always possessed a remarkable talent for making something of nothing. I shall not stay to spoil its pleasure."
She smiled at her sister-in-law as she said this, because the only way to deal with Lady Sophronia was to refuse, very politely, to be governed. Lady Sophronia sat with her gloves on her lap for a few moments longer. Then she rose, smoothed the front of her gown, and said several other things in the doorway about mourning, reputation, and the discomfort of public speculation. She pronounced each phrase as though it had personally inconvenienced her. Then she went out. Lady Iris waited until she heard the front door close. Only then did she take the notice from the desk, fold it, seal it, and call for the boy who ran her errands. She sent it to the Morning Chronicle by hand, with a note instructing them to run it in the next 3 editions. When the boy had gone, Lady Iris stood at the window and watched him hurry down Half Moon Street, his cap pulled low and the sealed paper tucked safe inside his coat. The street looked much as it always had. A carriage passed, a maid crossed with a covered basket over one arm. Somewhere nearby, a door opened, and a woman's voice called for a footman. Nothing had changed. And yet, to her surprise, Lady Iris found herself out of breath. 3 days later, in a tall, narrow boarding house in Bloomsbury, Mrs. Henrietta March was reading that very same notice over a cup of tea. She had read it through twice. She read it once more. The newspaper was a day old, borrowed from the gentleman in the second-floor rooms, and the corner of the page had been dipped in tea. The print had blurred a little there, but not enough to hide the words that mattered. A widow of modest establishment, lately bereaved, seeks the companionship of a lady of education and quiet disposition for a tour of the country. It was not the first notice she had studied over a cup of tea taken without milk or sugar. Since March, she had answered several. Companion to an elderly aunt in Chelsea, governess to 2 little girls in Kensington, reader to an invalid lady in Hampstead. None had come to anything. She was too old for some, too young for others, too gently bred for work, and too poor to remain idle. Mrs. Pike, the landlady, was clearing the breakfast things from the sideboard. The eggs had been taken away, the coffee pot had gone cold, and only a heel of bread remained beside the knife.
Will you take anything more than tea this morning, Mrs. March?
No, thank you.
Tea is not breakfast.
It will do very well.
It may do for a morning, it does not do for 3.
Mrs. March kept her eyes on the newspaper. Her rent bought the room, the fire when there was one, and the right to sit at the table. It did not buy eggs.
Anything in it?
Mrs. Pike asked, nodding at the paper.
A position, companion to a widow.
Mrs. March said. Mrs. Pike leaned closer to the paper.
And she means to take this companion travelling.
To Bath first.
Mrs. March said.
After that, it only says other parts of England.
A year earlier, Mrs. March had rented the small back room, arriving in deep mourning with 1 trunk, 2 letters of reference, and a face too tired for questions. Mrs. Pike had asked very few questions since. She knew only that Mrs. March paid her rent, spoke little of her late husband, and had grown thinner in the month since Christmas.
You will write to her then?
Mrs. Pike said.
I think I will.
Good.
Mrs. March folded the newspaper with care and took it up to her room. It was a small room at the back of the house, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a table set close beneath the window. From that window she could see the wall of the next house, a strip of grey sky, and, if she leaned a little, the chimney pots beyond. It was not an unpleasant room. Mrs. Pike kept it clean, and the coverlet had been mended in 2 places with neat little stitches. But Mrs. March had lived in it long enough to know every stain in the ceiling and every creak in the board near the door. She sat at the table and wrote her reply. She wrote it 3 times. The first was too eager. The second was too cold. The third was the one she sent.
Madam, having read your notice in the Morning Chronicle, I venture to offer myself for your consideration. I am in good health, have travelled little but read a great deal, and would be grateful for useful employment, whether in the country or upon the road. I can furnish references from my late father's bishop and from the rector of the parish in which I presently lodge. I am at liberty to begin at your convenience. Yours faithfully, Henrietta March.
She read it once after the ink had dried, and did not allow herself to read it again. Then she put on her bonnet, folded the letter into her reticule, and walked it to the post herself, because she did not trust her own resolution to last as far as the afternoon. It was a long walk for a woman who had eaten very little breakfast. The streets were warm, and the dust rose under the wheels of every passing carriage. Twice she was obliged to stop at a crossing and wait while carts passed by, and once outside a baker's shop, the warm scent of bread rose so suddenly about her that she had to turn her face away. When she came back to the boarding house, She sat for some minutes on the stairs before she could go up. In her room, she counted the money in her purse. £9, 4 shillings. The rent was due in a fortnight. Mrs. March closed the purse and held it for a moment in both hands. She had answered other notices. She had waited for replies that did not come, and sat through interviews in rooms where hope had deserted her before the first question was asked. This one was different. It had to be different. She could not afford to think of it as merely another possibility. It was the last one she could see. The interview was set for the following Tuesday at 3. Lady Iris received her in the yellow drawing-room of the house in Half Moon Street. She had dismissed the maid and set out the tea tray with her own hands, though she had no intention of pouring from it until she had decided whether she liked the woman. Lady Iris had been expecting someone of 50. Mrs. March, for her part, had asked at the door for Mrs. Bellamy, which was the name to which she had directed her letter, and had been corrected very gently by the footman who admitted her. He had said Lady Iris Bellamy, with the slight emphasis of a man who had said it many times that month to people who ought to have known. Mrs. March had felt the colour rise in her face and had thanked him, and had been shown up the stair, and had used the time on the stair to set her face again. She made her curtsy in the doorway and waited to be invited forward. The woman Lady Iris waved forward was tall, plainly dressed in grey muslin, with dark brown hair drawn smoothly back from a centre parting into a simple knot. Her face was oval and finely made, with pale skin, softly arched dark brows, and thoughtful hazel-brown eyes shadowed faintly by tiredness. She had a straight nose and a soft mouth held quietly, as though she had grown accustomed to saying less than she felt. There was nothing fashionable about her appearance, and yet she would, if she allowed herself to be, have been very handsome. Mrs. March took the measure of her potential employer. The lady at the tea tray was younger than the notice had led her to imagine. She was small and very neatly made, with a heart-shaped face and a pointed chin, and hazel eyes bright with private amusement. Her hair was a soft light chestnut, dressed plainly, with a few curls escaping at the temples. She was in half mourning, in a lavender muslin morning gown with small pearl drops at her ears, the only ornament about her. She looked, Mrs. March thought, like a person who had recently decided something.
I had thought you would be older.
Lady Iris said.
I am sorry, my lady.
No, it is of no consequence. Please sit down.
Mrs. March sat. She kept her hands folded in her lap. She did not look at the tea tray.
Mrs. March, I am going to be plain with you, because I do not think either of us has very much time to waste upon ceremony. I am a widow. My husband died of a fever 16 months ago, and since then I have been told, with great kindness and astonishing persistence, what I ought to do, what I must not do, and what would be best for me.
She set down her cup.
I have made up my mind to leave London for a year and discover what I think when no one is telling me. I do not require a chaperone. I should like a companion. Perhaps, in time, I should like a friend. I do not know whether you may become one, but I should very much like to find out.
Her expression softened, though her voice remained brisk.
Will you have some tea?
Thank you, my lady.
Mrs. March said.
I should be glad of some tea.
Lady Iris poured. Her hand was steadier than she expected. She handed the cup across, and then, after the smallest hesitation, set a small plate beside it, with cold chicken between 2 slices of bread and a piece of seed cake.
You must help me. I have been told I never eat enough to justify a tray.
Lady Iris said. Mrs. March looked at the plate as if she had not understood it.
Thank you,
she said. Lady Iris turned her eyes deliberately to her own cup and gave Mrs. March the kindness of not watching her eat.
You said in your letter that you have travelled little.
Scarcely at all, my lady.
And you wrote that you were in good health. I hope that is true, for I have no wish to hire a companion only to make an invalid of her before we reach Bath.
Mrs. March hesitated.
In good health, yes, truly. I have been somewhat fatigued, but there is no illness in it.
Lady Iris looked at her over the rim of her cup.
Have you ever wished to leave a place and never return to it?
She said.
Yes,
Mrs. March said.
often.
Good. Then we shall do very well together.
She set down her cup. She named the wages. She named the date of departure, a fortnight from the Saturday, and the route as far as Bath, beyond which she said she had not yet decided anything. She said it would be best, perhaps, if Mrs. March came to Half Moon Street the week before, so that they might begin to know each other before they were shut up together in a carriage. Mrs. March heard all of this through a faint ringing in her ears. She had eaten, she had been met with kindness, and yet relief had come so suddenly that it left her almost light-headed. She said yes to each thing in turn. When Lady Iris stood to ring for the maid, Mrs. March stood also, and made her curtsy, and was very nearly to the drawing-room door when Lady Iris spoke again.
Mrs. March.
She turned.
I am glad you came.
Thank you, my lady.
Lady Iris, if you please. We shall be much together after all.
Mrs. March inclined her head and went out, steadier than she had come in. In the hall, the maid handed her her shawl, and a young footman opened the door. Mrs. March stepped out into the late afternoon sun of Half Moon Street and made her way back to Bloomsbury on foot. Almost all the money she had left was in her purse, and she could not bring herself, on this of all afternoons, to spend any of it on a chair. When she reached the boarding-house, Mrs. Pike was in the hall.
Well,
I have the position.
to Bath?
Bath to begin with.
Mrs. Pike nodded as though she had known all along.
Sit down, my dear. I'll bring you a cup of something.
Mrs. March sat down on the stairs and put her hands over her face. She did not weep and did not speak. Presently Mrs. Pike came back with a cup of tea, strong and too sweet, and put it into her hands.
There now,
She said. Mrs. March drank because she was told to, and because it was warm. After a little while, she got up and went upstairs to her room to begin to pack. Chapter 2. To Bath. The carriage left Half Moon Street at 7 o'clock on a clear morning in early June, the horses freshly changed and the luggage strapped high, and Lady Iris was talking before they had so much as cleared the end of the street, certainly before they had reached Hyde Park.
I have not been on this road in 3 years.
She said.
Henry and I used to drive down to Bath in October to take the waters and complain about them. He said the water tasted like a copper kettle and the company was worse. I never quite believed him about the water until I tried it myself.
Mrs. March, who had risen at 4 to finish her packing, sat very still and listened. The carriage was a comfortable one, well sprung, with green silk curtains tied back at the windows. The footman who had handed her in had given her the seat facing forwards, which was the seat she should have refused and had not refused, because she was too tired to argue, and Lady Iris had waved her into it before she could speak.
Did you ever go to Bath?
Lady Iris asked.
No, my lady.
Lady Iris.
Lady Iris.
Mrs. March said.
That is better. I shall not give up until it comes naturally.
They came out of London by the Western Road, and by mid-morning they were among hedgerows and chalk. The sky was high and pale, sheep stood very still on the slope of a down. A boy with a crook watched them pass and lifted his hat, and Lady Iris waved at him through the window with the cheerful confidence of a woman long accustomed to friendly notice. They spoke about books for an hour. Mrs. March had read more than Lady Iris expected. Lady Iris had read less than Mrs. March had assumed of a baronet's widow, and laughed at her own ignorance in a way Mrs. March found difficult not to like. By the time they reached Marlborough, the rain had come down. The inn was a coaching inn of the older sort, with a yard that smelt of horse and damp straw, and a private parlour reserved in advance that proved hardly worth the trouble. The window of the parlour leaked at one corner, and a steady small drip fell from the casement into a bowl that the chambermaid had placed there with the air of a woman who had placed bowls there before. The dinner was poor, a fowl that had been roasted at least twice, a dish of beans of an indeterminate age, a tart that the cook should have been ashamed of. Mrs. March, who had grown used to accepting poor dinners without complaint, was preparing to praise the fowl when Lady Iris laid down her fork and looked at it with serious attention.
Mrs. March,
She said.
I want you to know, before another mile of our acquaintance has passed, that I have eaten in many inns of this country, and this is one of the worst dinners I have ever paid for. I would not wish you to think me a woman of low standards, nor would I wish you to think me a woman with any standards I could justify with this particular tart before me. Will you have some wine?
Mrs. March looked at her across the table and laughed. She laughed properly. It escaped her before she had decided to permit it. She had not laughed in over a year. Hearing herself do it felt strange, like catching a voice from another room. Lady Iris reached for the bottle and filled both their glasses, and went on filling them through the long, bad dinner and the rain on the casement and into the evening, until at last they went up to their rooms by candlelight along a creaking corridor that smelt faintly of pipe smoke. In her room, Mrs. March sat on the edge of the bed and did not undress for several minutes. She sat with her hands in her lap and thought about the laugh. She had not known she could still do it. They reached Bath the following afternoon, in good weather, and the carriage came down into the city by the road from Box, with the pale Bath stone rising in crescents on the hills above them. The lodgings Lady Iris had taken were in Laura Place, on the eastern side of the river. The house belonged to a Mrs. Cresswell, who had let the upper floors for the summer and lived herself in the rooms below. She was a thin woman, her fingers deft and manicured, suggesting a life dedicated to careful pursuits. She came out into the hall to greet them with a small speech she had evidently prepared. Lady Iris received the speech graciously, and Mrs. Cresswell vanished into her own quarters, having promised that supper would be brought up at 7. The rooms were on the first floor, a yellow drawing-room with a piano that had gone untouched for quite a while, 2 bedchambers opening off a small landing, and a stair that creaked on the 5th tread coming up. Mrs. March's bedchamber was the smaller of the 2 and faced over a courtyard garden where a sparrow was washing itself in a basin. Her trunk had been carried up before her. The bed had been turned down. She stood for a long moment in the doorway, looking at it before she went in. She had spent the past week being treated with a consideration she had not yet learned to expect. Even so, the sight of the turned-down bed and the chamber prepared for her gave her a strange feeling of unreality. She set her gloves down on the little dressing table and laid her bonnet beside them, and discovered, somewhat to her embarrassment, that her hands were shaking. By 7 o'clock, she had washed her face, smoothed her hair, and rejoined Lady Iris in the yellow drawing-room. The piano gleamed softly in the fading light. Lady Iris was at the window, looking down into the square.
There you are,
She said.
Mrs. Cresswell tells me she has done us a pigeon pie, and asparagus, and a syllabub. More than I dared hope for.
The pie was set on the table in a brown crust, the asparagus in a long dish beside it, and a jug of small ale, and a decanter of claret between them. Lady Iris served. The pigeons had been cooked well, the pastry was light, and the asparagus had come in that day from somebody's kitchen garden in the West Country. Mrs. March took the plate that Lady Iris passed her, laid her napkin on her lap and began, very carefully, to eat. She ate slowly. She put her fork down between mouthfuls. She drank a little of the small ale and did not refill the glass. She praised the pigeon and said nothing about the asparagus, though it was the best thing on the table. Gratitude had already made her voice less steady than she liked. Lady Iris told her about Bath. She had a great deal to say, the pump room and who would be there, and the circulating library on Milsom Street, and a modiste on the same street whose lavender silk ran to a shade her friend Cecily had once declared she would travel 40 miles to buy. She talked easily, the way she always talked, and filled Mrs. March's glass once with claret, without making any ceremony of it. When the syllabub came, Mrs. March ate it slowly, in small spoonfuls, with the quiet care of someone eating a favourite thing she had not tasted in a long time. Lady Iris, who was halfway through a story about her cousin Caroline and a disastrous music recital in Cheltenham, glanced across the table once, in the middle of the story, and noticed the heaviness about Mrs. March's eyes and the careful way she held herself upright. Lady Iris said nothing. She finished the story without faltering, then rang for Mrs. Cresswell to clear, and suggested that they go to bed early, since they had been travelling for the better part of 2 days. In her bedchamber, Mrs. March undressed slowly and lay down in the unfamiliar bed. and sleep took her almost at once. The post came up with the breakfast tray the next morning. Lady Iris was already at the table in the yellow drawing-room when Mrs. March came in a fresh muslin gown, her hair pinned neatly back. The window stood a few inches open, and the morning air came in cool and faintly damp, carrying the smell of stone and horses and something that might have been early blossom from the square below. A boy was sweeping the steps of a house opposite. Mrs. Cresswell had sent up a pot of chocolate and a basket of warm rolls, and Lady Iris had already lifted the letters from the tray and set them in a neat heap beside her plate.
"Good morning, my dear,"
she said.
"There is one from my brother. He must have written the moment he heard we were on the road."
Mrs. March poured herself a cup of chocolate and sat down. Lady Iris broke the seal.
"Shall I read it to you? I should like to. He writes the kind of letter that ought to be read aloud."
"Please, my lady."
"Lady Iris."
"Lady Iris,"
Mrs. March said with a smile. Lady Iris held the letter to catch the light from the window, and began. It was not a long letter, but it had been written with care. Lord Marcus hoped the road had not entirely undone her. He had been thinking of Lady Iris since the morning of her departure, and had begun a letter twice and thrown both away, and was sending this one only because he had become tired of opening drawers and finding earlier drafts. He had a few small pieces of news from Stoke Abney. Mr. Dunn, the rector, had preached on the subject of forbearance last Sunday, and had been overheard in the lane afterwards complaining at length about the choirmaster. As magistrate, Lord Marcus had also been obliged to hear a dispute about a hedge the previous Wednesday. It was a warm morning, and the hall door had been left open while vegetables were brought in from the kitchen garden. A hen from the yard had taken this as an invitation. She walked into the parlour during the hearing, crossed the room with great purpose, stopped in front of the bench and looked at him. He wrote, as though she were the one bringing charges. He had adjourned the hearing. Lady Iris laughed properly at the hen, with her hand at her cup, and the cup rattled against the saucer.
"Oh, Marcus."
She read the last part more quietly. He asked after her spirits. He said he thought of her every day. He hoped she would write, even briefly, even only to say she was well. He sent his affectionate regards to the lady who had agreed to travel with her, whose name his sister had not yet found a way to mention in any of her hurried notes from London, but whose existence was a great relief to him. He hoped she would be kind to his sister, who needed it more than she would ever say. Lady Iris folded the letter slowly and laid it on the table.
"He is very good,"
she said softly. She poured more chocolate. She wiped her eyes with the corner of her napkin in the matter-of-fact way of a woman who has wept at breakfast often enough not to remark on it, and reached for another roll.
"I shall write to him this week. The post goes on a Thursday from Bath,"
Lady Iris said. Mrs. March, as she had several times before, offered to transcribe a letter whenever Lady Iris wished. Lady Iris, who had let the offer pass on previous mornings, this time looked up. She regarded Mrs. March a moment, said nothing, and returned to her chocolate. Mrs. March did not see the look. She found she was still thinking about the hen and the man who had written about it. In her bedchamber that night, undressing by the light of a single candle, she found that the line about the hen was still in her head. She heard it the way Lord Marcus must have written it, in a voice she had not yet placed and could not now stop hearing. She smiled before she had quite decided to. Then she put out the candle and went to bed. Chapter 3. The Pump Room. By their 7th morning in Bath, the rhythm of the days had settled. They breakfasted late, walked to the pump room or the lending library, and returned to Laura Place at noon for cold meats and a glass of negus. Lady Iris would lie down on the yellow sofa with a book she did not read, while Mrs. March wrote letters or worked at a piece of mending she had carried from Bloomsbury and not yet finished. They dined at 5. After dinner, Lady Iris sat down at the piano and played badly, by her own admission, and with great enjoyment. Afterwards, they sat together by the fire until the candles burned low, then went up to bed. On this particular morning, Lady Iris had decided upon the pump room, and her reasons for doing so were thoroughly her own. And Mrs. Henderson, whom she had once known in town, and known rather well, in the sense that they had occupied the same drawing rooms for 2 successive seasons and found each other mutually, if politely, exhausting, was reported to be in Bath for her health. Lady Iris had a curiosity, not entirely charitable, to see whether the famous waters had improved Mrs. Henderson's temper, which had not, in her recollection, been among the woman's stronger qualities. Lady Iris wore her pearl grey sarcenet, pale and lustrous in the morning light, with narrow sleeves, a high waist, and a fichu of fine white muslin tucked neatly at the bodice. After midsummer she would be out of half mourning, and there would be no further occasion for so careful a shade. She meant to enjoy it while she could. Mrs. March wore her grey poplin walking dress, plain and well brushed, with gloves that had been mended at the thumb. The gown had been altered and remade more than once, and though she cared for it carefully, the seams and cuffs had begun to show the history of it. The pump room was full. A harpist had been engaged for the morning and was tuning her instrument by the window. An elderly gentleman in a green coat sat with his eyes closed in the warmth, his hands folded over his stick. 2 young women in white walked the length of the room very slowly, as though they had practiced. A footman in livery was pouring the famous water at the marble basin. Lady Iris took her glass and held it up to the light.
It is the colour of tea.
Lady Iris said.
Weak tea, left standing in the kitchen of a house that nobody lives in anymore.
She regarded it a moment longer.
I shall drink it.
She drank it and made a small face into the glass.
There,
She said.
I have done my part. I shall now feel briefly more virtuous, and we shall go and find Mrs. Henderson and see whether she has stopped being unpleasant.
They had not gone 3 steps before Mrs. March saw her. It was a woman by the window, in a yellow gown, slightly turned away. Mrs. March did not know the woman's name and could not have summoned it had her life depended on it. But she knew the tilt of the woman's head when she listened, the way her fingers moved when she spoke, the particular shade of brown in her hair where it was dressed high beneath her yellow silk bonnet. The woman had been at an evening party in a house off Russell Square 3 years before, and had said something to Mrs. March's husband that had made Thomas laugh in the way he had laughed when he was being cruel. Mrs. March stopped walking. She turned, very calmly, to a print that had been hung on the wall beside her, and pretended to study it. It was a view of the King's Bath. She could not, afterwards, have told anyone what it looked like. Lady Iris had taken another step, still scanning the room for Mrs. Henderson and already saying something about the harpist, when she felt, beneath her hand, a slight stiffening she had not expected.
Are you well, my dear?
She said.
Quite well,
Shall we walk a little further down?
if you would like.
Lady Iris turned them with great composure, and they walked down the other side of the room, away from the woman in the yellow gown, and out into the corridor that led to the colonnade. Lady Iris did not look back. She did not ask what had happened. She did not look at Mrs. March's face. She talked very steadily, all the way to the door, about the harpist and the gentleman in the green coat, and a Mrs. Simons she had decided they must invite to tea, until they were out in the street, and the warm summer air was on Mrs. March's face, and her hands had stopped shaking. Then Lady Iris said, lightly,
I have decided I do not care to see Mrs. Henderson after all. Shall we go to the library instead?
Yes,
Mrs. March said. They went to the library. They came back to Laura Place by way of the library, where Lady Iris had taken out a novel she did not mean to read, and Mrs. March had taken out a volume of Cowper she did. The negus was waiting for them. Mrs. Cresswell had laid cold ham on the sideboard with cucumber, bread and butter, and a small dish of mustard. They ate a little of each, and drank the negus, and spoke about nothing of any consequence, and Mrs. March felt something in her hands ease back to warmth. Lady Iris had been quiet through luncheon. When they had finished, she went to the sofa and lay down on it without speaking, and turned her face to the back of it, which was something she had not done before in Mrs. March's company. Mrs. March sat very still in her chair. After a moment, Lady Iris said, into the cushion,
I am tired.
Shall I ring for anything?
Mrs. March asked.
No, not that sort of tired.
Mrs. March said nothing. Lady Iris lay still for a long minute. Then she turned her face out into the room and looked up at the ceiling and said,
I cannot bear to write to Marcus today. I have been meaning to write all week. The post goes tomorrow and I cannot make myself do it. I do not know why some days are worse. I had been doing so well.
You have.
I had been thinking of him this morning, before the pump room. Henry used to complain about the waters every time we came here. This morning I found myself longing to hear him do so again.
I do not think the wanting of it ever quite leaves.
Will you write to Marcus?
Lady Iris said.
On my behalf, just to say I am well, the rooms in Laura Place are comfortable, and Mrs. Cresswell keeps a generous table, and that there has been a woman in the colonnade, carrying a parrot on her shoulder like a sailor, who I have seen now 3 days running, and who I am certain has named the parrot after a magistrate of her acquaintance. Tell him whatever else comes to mind. He likes small particular details.
She closed her eyes.
I should like him to know I have not forgotten him. I cannot quite do it myself today.
Mrs. March put down her cup.
I am not certain it is my place, my lady.
Lady Iris,
Lady Iris.
it is exactly your place. I am asking you. Tell him you write at my request and sign with your own initials. That is all. It is a small kindness, and you will do it well.
Mrs. March looked at her for a moment. Lady Iris's eyes were still closed. Her gown had crumpled at her shoulder where she had turned against the cushion. A faint pulse showed at her temple. She looked younger than she had looked at breakfast.
Very well.
Mrs. March said.
Thank you, my dear.
Mrs. March stood. She crossed the room to the small writing desk in the window, the one Mrs. Cresswell had set out for them when they arrived. There was paper in the drawer, a fresh pen and a stick of red wax in a brass dish. She sat down. She drew a sheet of paper toward her. She straightened it. She took up the pen. For a moment, she did not write anything. She looked out of the window at the square. The boy who had swept the steps that morning had finished, and a cat had taken his place on the warm stone. A nurse was walking a child in white along the pavement on the far side. Then she dipped the pen and held it over the paper and watched the ink gather very slowly at the nib without falling. The blank page lay in front of her. She had never written to a man she had not met. She began at the top of the page, in a formal manner.
Sir, your sister, Lady Iris Bellamy, has asked me to write to you on her behalf, as she has been a little tired this afternoon and finds the pen beyond her today. She has charged me with a number of things to say, and I shall set them down as faithfully as I am able.
Mrs. March read this through. It was correct. It was also the kind of sentence that any companion might have written to any gentleman on behalf of any employer, and it would do well enough, and no more than that. She set the pen down. The sun had moved a little in the window. The cat on the steps opposite had gone. She could hear faintly from the room behind her that Lady Iris's breathing had settled and that she had fallen asleep on the sofa. Mrs. March took up the pen again. She wrote about the lodgings and Mrs. Cresswell's capable management and the small oddities of Bath that Lady Iris thought Lord Marcus would like. She wrote that Lady Iris had seemed easier since leaving London, though she chose her words carefully. She wrote about the pump room and the harpist and the elderly gentleman in the green coat who had not opened his eyes once in the half hour they had been there. She wrote about the woman in the colonnade with the parrot on her shoulder and reported Lady Iris's settled opinion that the bird had been named after a magistrate. Mrs. March added that she could not judge the matter herself, having never had the pleasure of knowing either the parrot or the magistrate. She crossed that line out. After a moment she rewrote it with a lighter touch and let it stand. She paused over the water of Bath. After a moment she wrote,
Lady Iris will not have me give you any sober account of the waters. She maintains that they taste of weak tea left standing in the kitchen of a house long shut up, and is unwilling to place so severe a judgment under her own hand. I am therefore instructed to convey it under mine.
She read it through twice. It was not exactly what Lady Iris had said. Very nearly, and Lady Iris would not mind. But the small turn at the end was not Lady Iris's voice at all. It was her own. She let it stand. She signed the letter.
For Lady Iris Bellamy, with respect, H. March.
She sat for a moment, looking at the signature. The H was slightly uncertain. She had written hundreds of letters, but not one like this, in her own hand, to a gentleman she had never met. She looked at it for a moment, then blotted the ink. Then she folded the paper and reached for the wax and held the stick in the candle flame until a small bead of red came down onto the seam. She pressed it flat with the brass paperweight Mrs. Cresswell had left in the dish. She did not have a seal of her own. The wax was anonymous, which suited her. Lady Iris was still asleep on the sofa. Mrs. March moved quietly across the room, let herself out, and carried the letter downstairs herself so that it might go out with the evening post. She found she was already anticipating his reply. Chapter 4. A Postscript. Bath, a week later. The letter from Lord Marcus arrived on Friday morning. Mrs. Cresswell brought it up with the breakfast tray and set it beside Lady Iris's place, and Lady Iris saw the hand at once and broke the seal before she had touched her chocolate.
Marcus has written,
She said.
So I see,
Said Mrs. March.
and in a tolerably cheerful hand, which is a good sign. Marcus, when he is unhappy, writes as though the paper has offended him.
Lady Iris unfolded the letter and read it through to herself, which took some minutes, during which she laughed once and made a small sound of surprise twice, and at one point read a sentence aloud without seeming to notice she was doing so, something about a Mrs. Wilmot's terrier having made off with an entire pie at the church picnic. When she came to the end, she sat for a moment with the letter in her lap, smiling at it.
He is in good spirits.
Lady Iris said, settling back in her chair with the fond expression of a woman reading news she had hoped for.
The hay is in, and the rain kept him indoors a solid fortnight, which apparently led him to 4 novels he had not the least intention of reading. He holds me responsible for 2 of them, and I dare say he is right. He sends his love, and—
She stopped. She read the last few lines of the letter again to herself, and her smile altered slightly. Lady Iris looked up.
there is a postscript. I shall read it to you.
Mrs. March, who had been buttering a piece of toast, set the knife down. Lady Iris took up the letter.
Do tell your Mrs. March that her description of the woman with the parrot was the most diverting thing I have encountered in weeks, and that I find myself quite curious to learn what she thinks of the harpist they have taken on at the pump room. I have formed a theory about harpists, which wants the opinion of a sharp-eyed witness to settle it. She is welcome to write at her own convenience, or not at all, whichever she prefers. But I confess I should be very glad indeed of the letter.
Lady Iris lowered the paper. She looked across the breakfast table at Mrs. March with the same smile as before, only now there was a small, private brightness behind it. The look of a woman who has just understood something she had not quite expected and has not yet decided what to do with it. Mrs. March did not look up. She picked the butter knife up again and finished the slice of toast she had been working on, and put it on her plate, and took up her cup.
I should be sorry to disappoint a man with a theory,
She said.
You will write to him then?
It seems impolite not to.
It does.
Said Lady Iris with great gravity.
It would be most discourteous.
She did not mention it again. Instead, she directed her attention to the remainder of her letters and started to slice open envelopes with the delicate silver knife that Mrs. Cresswell had left for her. It was not until they had both completed their breakfast that she cast another glance at Mrs. March, by which time Mrs. March's hands were completely steady and her complexion had returned to its natural hue. But once, whilst unfolding a letter from a cousin in Hertfordshire, Lady Iris glanced up over the rim of her cup and smiled, very slightly to herself, and returned to the page. She did not write to him that morning. She told herself there was no hurry. The post did not go until Tuesday, and a letter written in haste would show it. She would write in the evening, once she had thought more carefully about the harpist, after Lady Iris had retired for the night and the house fell into stillness. She thought about the harpist a great deal that day. She thought about the harpist in the lending library, while Lady Iris moved along the shelves of new novels, and Mrs. March stood beside her, turning pages without reading them. She thought about her on the walk back to Laura Place, while Lady Iris told her something about a Mrs. Simons and her 3 daughters, and Mrs. March answered in approximately the right places. She thought about her at dinner, where she was unusually quiet, and Lady Iris, who noticed but did not remark on it, was unusually kind. After dinner, Lady Iris played at the piano for half an hour and then declared herself ready for bed.
You mean to sit up a while, I think.
Lady Iris said, pausing at the door.
I had thought to.
Good night, Henrietta.
Good night, Lady Iris.
Mrs. March held off until the sound of Lady Iris's door clicked shut on the upper floor. Then she retrieved a new candle and went to the writing desk by the window, spread out the paper, trimmed the pen, and sat down. For a moment she did not write anything. Then she began.
Sir.
She stopped and put the pen down and looked at the word for some time. Sir was correct. Sir was what one wrote at the head of a letter to a gentleman one had not met. But she was no longer writing on behalf of Lady Iris. She was answering, under her own name, a man who had asked to hear from her. Sir was too formal for that, and my lord was too formal still, and dear Lord Marcus was forward in a way she could not yet make herself be. She crossed out Sir. She wrote,
My lord.
She looked at that for a moment too. It would do. It was correct, and it did not commit her to anything warmer than she was ready to offer. She dipped the pen again and began.
My lord, Lady Iris read me your postscript at breakfast, and I have been thinking about your mysterious theory of harpists all day, which suggests either that it is very intriguing or that I have been a very poor companion this afternoon. Possibly both. I am afraid I cannot offer you an expert witness. I have heard very little harp music in my life, and what I heard at the pump room seemed agreeable enough. I did observe, however, that the harpist was admired most when she paused to arrange her shawl, and least when she was playing the more difficult passages. This may support your theory, though I do not yet know what your theory is. I shall be glad to hear it, and to be told whether I have done the harpist an injustice.
She read this through. It was, she thought, a little too long, and a little too pleased with itself. She crossed out the possibly both and read it through again. It was better without. But she missed the line, and after a moment she put it back. She wrote 2 more paragraphs. She wrote a little about the lending library, and about Mrs. Simon's 3 daughters, whom Lady Iris was determined they should know, and Mrs. March was equally determined they should not, and which of them she thought would prevail. She wrote a small thing about the cat on the steps opposite the lodgings, who had now been there every morning for more than a week and was beginning to look permanent. Then she stopped and looked at the bottom of the page. The signature was what she had been turning over all day, not at the surface of her mind, but underneath everything else, quiet and unexamined, until this moment. She could sign H. March, as she had signed Lady Iris's letter. H. March was what a companion signed. It was the safe form, the small form, the form that committed her to nothing. It would acknowledge his courtesy without offering anything of herself in return. She could sign Henrietta March. She sat with the pen in her hand for some time. The previous week she had written for Lady Iris, and an initial had been enough. This was different. This was a letter of her own, sent to a gentleman who had asked for her thoughts on a harpist, and it required a name. The candle had burned down by perhaps an inch. She wrote, Henrietta March. She looked at the name. It was a name she had not seen in her own hand in a long time. The H was uncertain, but the rest followed more steadily, as though some part of her had remembered itself. She blotted the ink, then she folded the paper, sealed it, and held it for a moment in her hand, and very nearly did not send it. She rang the bell. When the maid came up, Mrs. March gave her the letter to be taken to the receiving office in the morning. The maid bobbed a small curtsy and went away with it down the creaking stair. Mrs. March sat at the desk. She heard the maid's footsteps fade away, followed by the subtle nighttime murmurs of the house. The candle emitted a brief, sharp crackle as a fragment of wick tumbled down. She had signed her own name. His reply came back on the Tuesday following. There were 2 letters in Mrs. Cresswell's hand when she brought the tray up. The smaller of the 2 was for Lady Iris, in Lord Marcus's hand. The larger one, also in Lord Marcus's hand, was for Mrs. March. Lady Iris looked at the 2 letters for a moment, and then handed Mrs. March's to her.
Mine is the thinner letter this morning,
She said, with a glance at the one in Mrs. March's hand.
I am being economized on.
How gratifying to discover economy in a brother, even when it is at my expense.
Mrs. March took her letter. She did not open it at the table. She put it beside her plate and finished her breakfast, and then carried it upstairs to her room and shut the door, and sat down in the small chair by the window and broke the seal.
My dear Mrs. March, your letter arrived on Saturday, and I have been very glad of it. Your observation about the harpist is exactly the sort of evidence my theory required. If she was most admired while arranging her shawl and least attended to while playing the more difficult passages, then I think my case is nearly made. The harp, I have long maintained, is the only instrument in England whose performer is expected to provide both music and a picture. A violinist may look cross, a flautist may look consumptive, and a singer may be forgiven almost anything if she reaches the note. But a harpist must always appear as though she has just stepped out of a painting. This is very unfair to harpists, and very useful to my theory. I have heard one excellent harpist in my life. She was near 60, wore spectacles, and played to a room that emptied by half before the second piece. I have also heard several pretty harpists play very indifferently to rooms full of gentlemen who declared themselves enchanted. From this I have drawn conclusions, though perhaps not charitable ones. Lady Iris writes that you have decided against Mrs. Simons's daughters. I think this is wise. I have not met Mrs. Simons, but I have met her sort, and there is nothing to be gained by knowing 3 young women whose mother is quietly measuring your patience for the eldest of them. You will tell me, I hope, what you do instead with your afternoons. The hens at Stoke Abney continue in their habits. The one which interrupted the hedge dispute in my parlour last month has been named Mrs. Justice by the cook, and I find I have not the heart to object. Your parrot has evidently started a fashion. Regarding the cat on the steps, I feel for the creature who seems to be drawn into a domestic arrangement that has not been formally offered to him. There is a cat at Stoke Abney who has spent the last 11 years lingering about the kitchen step without ever becoming a kitchen cat, and I have come to admire him. He pays no rent and answers to no one. I commend him to your cat as an example. Will you write to me again? I do not wish to impose, but I am at present supplied with very little of interest in Hampshire, and your letter has been the brightest thing in my week. Tell me what you read, what Lady Iris is amusing herself with, and whether the gentleman in the green coat returns. I have grown fond of him. Yours, with respect, and with very real pleasure, Marcus Bellamy.
Mrs. March read the letter through twice. Then she folded it and laid it in the drawer of the small dressing table, and went down to Lady Iris. The 2 weeks that followed had the shape of all their other weeks in Bath, which is to say they had the shape of mornings and walks and luncheons and afternoons at the lending library and dinners at 5 and evenings by the fire. But underneath that shape, another rhythm had set itself up, very quietly, in Mrs. March's days. She wrote to Lord Marcus on the Wednesday, and his reply came on the Friday. She wrote again on the Sunday, and his reply came on the Tuesday. She penned a 3rd letter on the Wednesday that followed, and a 4th on the Saturday, by which time it had become a routine that she did not examine too closely. The letters were brief. They touched upon the harpist, the gentleman in the green coat who had reappeared, sporting an unusual handkerchief, a buttered crab that Mrs. Cresswell had served them for supper one evening, and a stroll that Lady Iris and Mrs. March had taken up to the Royal Crescent in the rain. They also mentioned the cat on the steps, which had ultimately been welcomed by Mrs. Cresswell's cook, and now carried himself as though the house had always been his domain. They touched on a book Mrs. March had borrowed from the lending library, authored by Mrs. Inchbald, which she hadn't picked up since her youth, and which Lord Marcus had read and found wanting, softly, in a manner that spurred her to defend it. She began to listen for the postboy each morning, without quite admitting to herself that she was listening for him. She had begun to collect phrases while Lady Iris talked at dinner. A word, a turn of thought, something that might do for the next letter. She would tuck it away and return to it at the writing desk in the evening, and find sometimes that it had sharpened in the meanwhile without any effort on her part. She began, also, to recover a habit she had not had in over a year. She found herself amused by things. A phrase in a letter, a cat's offended dignity. Lady Iris's account of Mrs. Simons's daughters, the solemn progress of a parrot through the colonnade. Small absurdities began to reach her again. The postboy came at 10:30, and she could catch the sound of his boots on the steps from the breakfast room. The small lifting feeling in her chest at the noise was something different, something she initially struggled to name. She refrained from naming it altogether. She told herself it was simply the pleasure of a witty correspondent, a respectable thing, and one she had been without for a long time. She told herself that Lord Marcus wrote good letters, and that she was glad to read them, and that this was the whole of it. One morning at breakfast, the post came later than usual. The bell sounded below, and Mrs. March looked up before Mrs. Cresswell had even crossed the hall. Lady Iris was watching her over the rim of her chocolate cup, with an expression of such mild innocence that it could not possibly have been innocent at all. Lady Iris said nothing. Mrs. March returned to her toast. Still, the moment had not passed unnoticed. Mrs. March had betrayed herself by looking up, and Lady Iris had seen it. Neither of them mentioned the matter. A little later, Mrs. Cresswell's step came up the stairs, the letters were brought in, and breakfast went on. Chapter 5. The Road North. Leaving Bath, on the long road to Buxton, they left Bath at 9:30 on a fine morning in the last week of June. Mrs. Cresswell stood on the steps and waved them off with the particular composure of a woman who had been letting rooms to ladies for 30 years and had developed her own opinion of every guest by the third morning. She said she had enjoyed having Lady Iris, and Mrs. March no less, and she hoped they would think of Laura Place when they returned south, if they returned south, which she thought they would. The cat on the steps did not look up. Lady Iris waved a gloved hand at her from the carriage window and said, when they had turned out of the square, that she should miss Mrs. Cresswell more than she had any right to, and that they had been there exactly the right length of time. The road carried them out of Bath by the London road and on toward Box and Chippenham. The city fell behind them by degrees, first in terraces and garden walls, then in scattered cottages, and before long the chalk country opened beyond the carriage windows. The morning was clear. The shadows of clouds moved across the downs in slow shapes. Lady Iris had a book on her lap that she did not open. Mrs. March had a piece of mending in a small bag at her feet that she did not take out. For the first hour, neither of them spoke much. There was a particular pleasure in leaving a place one had liked while the liking was still fresh, before familiarity had dulled the edges of it. Mrs. March, watching the downs, felt her shoulders ease in a way she had not expected. The clean light, the smell of grass through the open window, the unhurried gait of the horses on the long, flat stretch beyond Box. These had nothing to do with anything she had set out to feel, and they reached her anyway. She had not had a clear summer morning in the country since the year before her marriage. Lady Iris was watching her.
You are smiling, Henrietta.
I beg your pardon.
No, do not beg my pardon. I have not seen you look so pleased before. The country suits you.
Mrs. March turned her face back to the window. They changed horses at Chippenham and again at Cirencester, and somewhere between the two Mrs. March could not afterwards have said which stretch of road it had been. Lady Iris began to speak about her husband. She did not begin with his death. She began with a country ball in Oxfordshire, when she had been 20 and was staying there on a visit to her aunt. She had worn a white muslin gown with short puffed sleeves, a pale green sash, and a wreath of small leaves in her hair, which she had thought, at the time, very dashing, and now suspected had been ridiculous. Henry had come over and asked her to dance. Her aunt, who knew the family, had accepted for her before she could open her mouth, which was just as well, since she had not been able to open it. He had been 26 and the calmest man she had ever known. He had said almost nothing through the first dance. In the second, he had grown a little less silent, and when the music ended and he led her back to her aunt, he told her that he must return to London in the morning, but that he hoped she would permit him to write to her. She had not known how to answer. Lady Iris smiled a little at the memory.
He did write. He returned to London the next morning, and after that there was a letter every Tuesday for 9 weeks. I have the letters still. They are mostly about the weather, with one paragraph at the end of each that was not about the weather. By the 7th week, I knew. By the 9th week, he returned and proposed beside the Cherwell, which is not where one proposes if one wishes to be composed. The path was muddy, the water was low, and my aunt was close enough behind us to hear every third word. The proposal was therefore a very quiet one. I said yes in such a low voice that he had to ask me to repeat it, which I never let him forget. We were married in September. We had almost 3 years.
For a moment she said nothing, only watched the pale downs pass beyond the window.
Henry was taken with a fever in November. 3 days later, he was gone. I have been told since that 3 days is a mercy. I do not find it so.
Mrs. March, without thinking, reached across and took her hand. Lady Iris did not look at her. Her hand remained quietly in Mrs. March's. They sat like that for some time without speaking. The carriage rolled on through the long open country. A buzzard wheeled slowly overhead. In the distance, a flock of starlings rose from a stubble field and turned together above the pale road. After a while, Lady Iris said,
Marcus was very good to me. He came up to London the same day. He stayed 3 weeks. He did not have to come. He had lost Eleanor 6 years before in childbirth, and the child as well, and I think he had not been in a house of mourning since. But he came. He sat with me and did not say anything most of the time, and that was exactly the right thing for him to do.
I am sorry.
Mrs. March said.
Thank you. I think you understand.
Neither of them spoke for some miles. The road climbed, and the chalk opened out on either side, and the white sheep grazed on the pale downs. Mrs. March watched the country pass, Lady Iris's hand still resting in hers. Something had altered between them since morning. They had left Bath as mistress and companion, or something near it. By the time the carriage turned toward Warwick, they were no longer quite that. She did not let go. They stopped at a coaching inn on the road into Warwick, a little after 6. It was a square-fronted house with a busy yard, and the landlord had given them a small private parlour at the back on the strength of Lady Iris's letter of 2 days before. There was a fire laid in the parlour grate against the cool of the evening. A cold supper had been set out on a side table. Roast chicken carved neatly on a platter, thin slices of tongue, a salad of cresses, a wedge of pale yellow cheese, pickled walnuts in a small blue dish, fresh bread and butter, and a bowl of strawberries. The landlord had sent up a bottle of claret and a jug of small beer, and left them to themselves. They ate slowly. Neither of them had been very hungry, but the food was good, and there was a quiet pleasure in being still after a day of motion. Lady Iris ate some of the chicken and most of a strawberry, and pushed the rest about her plate. Mrs. March ate more steadily, conscious that someone in the room needed to. The fire settled, the candles were lit. After supper they did not move to the inn's public rooms. Lady Iris stayed in the chair by the fire with her feet on a small footstool the landlord had brought, and Mrs. March took the chair opposite, and they sat for a long time in the firelight without saying very much. The room was warm. The shutters had been closed against the courtyard. From somewhere in the inn there was a sound of plates being cleared, and a man's voice in a low conversation, and the soft tread of a maid going up the back stair with hot water. After a while, Lady Iris said,
Tell me about him, Henrietta, if you can.
Mrs. March looked into the fire. She knew whom Lady Iris meant.
There is not very much to tell. I was 22 when we married. We had 3 years. We were not happy.
No?
No.
Lady Iris did not press her. She watched the fire. After a moment, Mrs. March added,
He was not a cruel man, or not in the ordinary way of cruelty. He was a barrister. He had chambers in the Temple and a great many opinions and a sharp tongue for all of them, and he was clever, and he liked to make me feel that I was less clever than he was, which was not difficult, because I was very young and he was nearly 30. We had a narrow house in Hans Town, near Sloane Street, which was as much as his practice would run to, and which he was ashamed of, and which I did not mind nearly as much as he did. He was away at the courts a great deal. When he was at home, he read his briefs at the dinner table and did not care to be spoken to. By the 2nd year, I had stopped trying to be clever in his company. By the 3rd, I had stopped trying to speak in his company at all. When he died, I was very tired.
She stopped there and did not go on to say how he had died, and Lady Iris did not ask.
That is more than I had meant to say.
I am glad you said it.
Thank you.
For a little while, Lady Iris said nothing. When she spoke again, her voice was very quiet.
I have not told you all of it.
Mrs. March waited.
I was carrying a child when Henry died. I was nearly 4 months along. I lost it a fortnight after the funeral. The midwife said it had been a girl. I have thought of her as one ever since.
She said all of this without looking up from the fire.
I have not been able to say that aloud before tonight. Not to anybody. Sophronia knew because she was in the house, but we have not spoken of it. My mother knew, but she died in the spring. Marcus does not know. I could not write it to him.
Mrs. March moved without thinking. She crossed the small space between the chairs and knelt by Lady Iris's side and took her hand. Lady Iris did not look at her.
Thank you for not telling me you are sorry.
I am, all the same.
Yes, I know.
She did look down then at Mrs. March's hand on hers, and her face altered slightly, the way a face alters when a long-carried thing is set down for a moment.
I do not know how I should have borne tonight without you.
Lady Iris said,
You would have borne it, but I am glad you did not have to bear it alone.
They stayed like that for some time. The fire burned low. Somewhere in the inn, a clock struck 10. A door closed downstairs. The murmur of voices in the public room had thinned. After a while, Lady Iris said,
I should go up.
Lady Iris rose slowly, but she did not release Mrs. March's hand at once. For a moment she stood with her fingers resting in Mrs. March's, as though there was something more she meant to say. Then she pressed her hand once, let go, and went upstairs. Mrs. March stayed in the chair by the fire. She did not move for some time. The fire settled to embers. The inn settled to sleep around her. She thought of Lady Iris in the room above, and of the child the midwife had said was a girl, and of the fortnight between the funeral and the loss which she had just been told about and would not, ever, ask about again. At last she rose, set the fireguard before the grate, took her candle, and climbed the stairs. It was after 11 when Mrs. March came up to her room. The inn was settling around her, a door closing on the floor below, a man speaking quietly to a woman on the stair, the faint scrape of a bucket in the yard. Her candle, set down on the chest by the window, made a small bright island in the dim room. The fire had been banked, the bed had been turned down for her by a chambermaid she had not seen. She sat on the edge of the bed and did not move for a long while. She was very tired. The kind of tired that comes from a day in a carriage and an evening of holding still while another woman tells the truth. Her shoulders ached, her hands were cold. She thought she should undress and could not yet make herself begin. She had spoken too, not much. A few sentences about Thomas, said into a fire, to a woman who had not pressed her for more. It was less than Lady Iris had given her, and Lady Iris had taken it as though it were not less. But Mrs. March had not said even that much to anyone in over a year, and she found, sitting on the edge of the bed in a strange room, that she did not quite know what she had done by saying it. It was not regret. It was nearer to the feeling of having set down something heavy and not yet being sure her arms believed it. After a few minutes, she rose and crossed to the small table by the window. There she lit a second candle from the first, opened the writing case Mrs. Cresswell had insisted she take with her from Bath, and drew out a sheet of paper. She trimmed the pen.
My lord, we're at Warwick tonight, in an inn whose name I have not asked, with a small fire and a very good supper of cold chicken and pickled walnuts behind us. The day on the road was a fine one. The country between Bath and here is mostly chalk, and the downs roll on for miles together on either side of the road, with sheep grazing quietly on the slopes. I had not seen country of that kind before. The carriage stopped once on the open road, while a flock was being driven across ahead of them. The shepherds whistled to their dogs in a way I could not have imagined, a long note and a short one, and the dog turned. 2 short notes, and the dog came back. The whistles carried a great distance across the open ground. Lady Iris and I listened until the road was clear, and I have been thinking about them this evening. I find I should like to learn how it is done, though I have nobody to ask and no dog to practice on.
She paused.
Lady Iris has been well. We are to go on to Buxton in the morning. I shall write again from the road. Yours, Henrietta March.
She read it through. It was a thinner letter than her recent letters had been. She thought, looking at it, that he would not mind. He had said himself that he liked small, particular things, and the whistles were a small, particular thing. She folded the paper, sealed it carefully, and set the seal aside. Then she sat with the letter in her hand for some time. Across the corridor, Lady Iris would by now be asleep, or pretending to be. Mrs. March saw again the little parlour below, the fire low in the grate, Lady Iris's hand held in hers, and the quiet truth that had passed between them. And then, in spite of herself, her mind went to Lord Marcus in Hampshire. He had come to London the day his brother-in-law died and stayed with Lady Iris for 3 weeks, quiet enough not to burden her, steady enough not to leave. On Friday morning at Stoke Abney, he would read her letter about sheep and shepherds' whistles, and know nothing of Warwick, or the fire, or the grief that had been set down between 2 women that night. That was as it should be. She had decided, somewhere between the writing desk and the bed, that the rest of the day was not his to be given. Lady Iris's grief belonged to Lady Iris. Her own marriage belonged to herself. Neither of those things belonged in a letter written at the end of a long day to a man she had never met. She laid the letter on the small table by the bed. The candle was burning low. She undressed at last and put out the candle and lay in the dark. The inn had quieted. She could hear very faintly a horse moving in the yard. She thought of the whistles again, the long note and the short one, and the dog turning. She thought of Lord Marcus's hand on the page she had written, which he had not yet read. She thought of the morning, and the road north, and the pale downs opening wide on either side of the carriage. She did not let herself wonder, in the dark, what he would make of her if he ever knew the whole of it. That question could wait for another night. Chapter 6. Buxton, Derbyshire, in July. They came into Buxton late on a grey afternoon, with the hills drawn close about the town and the last light lying across their slopes. Buxton was smaller than Bath and far less grand, but Lady Iris had taken to it before the hour was out. The road brought them past the great curve of the crescent, pale stone in the failing light, and then on through streets where the elegant soon gave way to plainer sights. A butcher, a saddler, a candlemaker's shop with the shutters half up. The lodgings Lady Iris had taken were in a tall, narrow house above a draper's, kept by a Mrs. Ferrand, a widow of few words, with a ring of keys at her waist, and no wasted movement. She showed them their rooms, told them when breakfast and supper were served, and left them to settle. Lady Iris stood at the window of the small sitting-room and looked down into the street.
I find I am very glad to be somewhere people are not forever examining one another. In Bath one was always slightly on parade. Here I believe a person might walk about for a week and be of no great interest to anyone but the weather.
You liked being on parade in Bath.
Mrs. March said.
I liked parts of it. I liked the pump room because the water was so very bad that complaining of it gave one something to do. But a month of it was enough, and I find I do not miss it at all, which I had not expected.
She turned from the window.
I expected to miss it a great deal. I had quite looked forward to missing it. It is disappointing to be so easily contented.
The hills were what drew Mrs. March first. She had never seen country quite like it. The chalk countryside on the road north had been soft and rolling and full of sheep. Here the hills rose higher, with fewer trees, fewer hedges, and more bare stone showing through. The land climbed toward a hard line against the sky, where the grass thinned, the grey stone showed through, and the clouds seemed almost low enough to touch. From the window of her room she could see, above the roofs of the town, a long open shoulder of moor with nothing on it at all. No house, no wall, no tree, only grass and the slow shadows of clouds moving across it. She stood and looked at it for some time. Supper was laid in a small dining room. A haunch of mutton, a dish of new peas, fresh bread, ale for Lady Iris, who had lately taken a fancy to it, and a glass of wine for Mrs. March, who had not yet been persuaded to like it. Afterwards there was gooseberry fool in 2 small glass dishes, pale green and softly folded with cream. Mrs. Ferrand cooked plainly and very well. The mutton was tender, the peas were sweet and shining with butter, and Mrs. March ate everything on her plate. Then, when Lady Iris offered her the dish again, she took a little more. Halfway through the gooseberry fool, she noticed that she was eating because she wanted to, not because Lady Iris was watching to make sure she did. It was not a thought she dwelt on. The thought passed quickly, like the cloud shadow over the moor, but she remembered it after the spoon was set down. Lady Iris noticed too, and said nothing. By now Mrs. March knew Lady Iris could be silent and still see everything. Lady Iris had observed, over the past fortnight, that the grey walking dress no longer pulled so loosely at her companion's shoulders and waist, and that her face no longer had the pinched, exhausted look Lady Iris remembered from the yellow drawing-room in Half Moon Street. She did not remark on any of it. She talked instead about the great curve of the Buxton crescent, which she meant for them to admire very early, before the town was quite awake, and about Mrs. Ferrand, whom she had decided she admired. As for the following week, she had a plan already forming, but for the moment she kept it to herself. After supper, Lady Iris went upstairs to write her letters. Mrs. March remained a moment in the dining room. Then she rose, crossed into the narrow hall, and stopped. A window had been left open on the half landing above, and the air came down through the house from the moorland beyond the town. It was cold and clean, and it carried the low sound of wind crossing open ground, with nothing to stand in its way. Underneath it, the house made its own quiet sounds. Mrs. Ferrand moving somewhere downstairs, a door closing softly, a board creaking overhead. Through it all, that low moorland sound continued. Mrs. March stood in the dim hall and listened. She thought again of the gooseberry fool, and of how strange it had felt to take another spoonful because she wanted it. Then she went up the stairs to bed. Lady Iris took them along the Buxton crescent the next morning, very early, while the first light still lay pale on the stone, and almost no one was about. She pronounced it everything she had hoped for, but again and again she found herself looking toward the moor. By the 3rd day she had decided they must go up onto the moor itself, not merely look at it from the windows. Mrs. Ferrand was consulted, a path was described, and by late morning, a basket had been made ready with cold roast fowl, a loaf of bread, and a small pot of butter. Soon afterwards they set out. It was a long climb. The path rose behind the town, crossed 2 sloping fields, and passed through a gate onto open ground. Beyond the gate there was no wall, no hedge, no mark of settlement, only a pale track worn through the heather and grass, climbing toward the open moor. They climbed slowly. Lady Iris talked while the path was gentle, and less once it steepened. By the time the ground levelled, they were both quiet, breathing hard, and not sorry to be silent. Near the top, A long grey stone lay half sunk in the turf, with the town and valley spread below. They sat on it for a while, catching their breath. The wind was strong up there. It was not violent, but it was constant, and it seemed to have crossed miles of open ground, bringing only cold air and the dry, honeyed smell of heather. It took the words from their mouths and carried them off before they were fully spoken, so that anything said there had to be worth the effort. Below them the town was small and grey in its valley, and seen from that height, the crescent was only a pale curve in the town. Beyond it the hills receded in folds of blue, and on a far green slope a scatter of sheep shifted so slowly they hardly seemed to move. The sky seemed enormous, with slow clouds crossing the whole of it. Cloud shadows moved over the moor below them in the same unhurried shapes Mrs. March had watched from the carriage and from her window. Now those same shadows passed over her own hands and gown. With each shadow came a touch of cold, brief as a hand laid over hers and lifted again. They sat for a while without talking. In that wind, even a few words had to be chosen carefully. Then Lady Iris spoke.
I have been thinking.
Mrs. March turned her head. Lady Iris looked out at the hills.
I shall write to Marcus and ask him to join us at the lakes.
The wind moved between them, sharp and clean.
It has been too long since I saw him. He has been alone in that house with his estate business, his village quarrels, and far too many quiet rooms, and I think the air would do him good.
She paused, still looking out at the hills, though Mrs. March knew very well that Lady Iris did not need to turn her head to read her face.
I think he will come, if I tell him plainly that I want him to join us.
The wind swept across the flat stone between them. Several feelings came to Mrs. March at once, and none of them would be quieted. She thought of the letters she had read by candlelight, at one inn after another, and of the folded pages lying in her writing case, where she sometimes laid her hand over them in the carriage without quite knowing she had done it. The man who had existed until now in ink and folded paper was going to stand before her. She had wanted this, and had not let herself know she wanted it. And now the wanting and the fear had become so closely tangled that she could no longer tell one from the other. She could not look straight at the thought. It was like the sky above them, too wide to look at for more than a moment. Lady Iris was looking toward the hills, but Mrs. March knew she was being watched all the same, and that whatever she did with her face in the next moment would be seen, and remembered, and not mentioned. She made herself smile, and when she spoke, her voice was very bright.
What a lovely thought.
The wind took most of it. Lady Iris heard enough and nodded, then looked back out at the countryside as though they had merely settled the arrival of a guest, and not begun something neither of them was ready to name. She began to say something about the road from Hampshire, and how long it would take him, and how he must be made to stay a proper while, and not hurry back to his sessions after a week. The wind carried most of that away too, so that afterwards Mrs. March could not have said what else had been decided on that windy hill, only that something had shifted, that she had agreed to it, and that her face had betrayed nothing. She sat on the flat stone, the wind in her hair, her hands folded in her lap, and the blue hills and grey valley spreading away below her. She smiled at Lady Iris, then turned her face away into the wind, where no one could tell whether she was smiling still. She did not write to him at once. She went upstairs when Lady Iris did, undressed, and lay for a while in the dark, listening to the wind push and murmur at the corner of the house. Sleep would not come. After a time she got up again, lit the candle, and sat down at the small table beneath the window in her nightgown, with a shawl about her shoulders. She had meant only to write the usual sort of letter, about the walk, the flat stone, the sheep on the far slope, and the wind that took the words out of one's mouth. She wrote about the wind, and then could write no more. She sat with the pen above the paper, and found she did not want to write the usual sort of letter. She was too tired to summon caution. It was very late. The house was asleep. The candle threw a small circle of light over the table, and left the corners of the room in shadow, and the moor still stretched beyond the town in the dark, unchanged by the sleeping houses below it, as it had been long before the town was built. Something about the lateness, or the wind, or the long day, had worn through the guard she usually kept around herself. She was not careful tonight. She had no strength left for it. She wrote,
My lord, I will tell you something tonight, though I shall tell it sideways, because I find I cannot tell it straight and do not mean to try. I knew a woman once who lost the use of her own voice. Not in the ordinary sense. She could speak. She answered when addressed and said the expected things. But the voice that was truly hers, the one she used when she was not protecting herself, grew quiet and stayed so for more than a year. She did not decide it. It was not grief exactly, though grief was in it. It was more that she had learned, over many years, that her own voice cost her something every time she used it. And at last, some part of her learned the cost and decided it was too dear. She put the voice away, the way one puts away a delicate thing, because it is never taken out without being harmed. She lived in that silence, day after day. She moved through her days as though she had become no one in particular. She rose, dressed, answered questions, sat down to meals, and did what the day required. By evening, she was very tired from work she could not afterward account for, because the real work had been keeping quiet, and one does not see that as work until one stops. And then, I will not tell you how, not tonight, she found her voice coming back. Not all at once, in small ways, and at first by accident. She made a remark one day that was hers and not the safe one, and nothing dreadful followed. She wrote a sentence that sounded like herself and was frightened of it and let it stand. She found herself, one ordinary morning, and waiting for a letter with an eagerness she had thought she could no longer feel. It is a strange thing to feel a part of oneself come back. It does not feel like joy. It feels like the pins and needles in a limb one has lain on too long. The return hurts in its own way. One is glad of it, and still it is not comfortable at all. I do not know why I am telling you this, except that it is very late, and the wind here takes things out of one's mouth almost before they are spoken. I have been a long time saying very little that was truly mine. Yours, Henrietta March.
She did not read it through. Only afterwards did she understand that this had been a decision, though it had not felt like a decision at the time. On every other night she had read the letter through, once at least, and crossed out a line that revealed too much, and rewrote it until it gave less away. That second reading was always when caution returned. Tonight she did not give it the chance. She folded it while the ink was scarcely dry, sealed it, and set it ready for the morning post. Then she put out the candle, lay down, and slept more quickly than she had in weeks, as one sleeps after setting down a weight before fear has had time to follow. The fear came in the morning. It came before she was properly awake. She woke with a cold knot in her stomach before she remembered the reason for it. She lay still and went back over what she had written, as nearly as she could recover it, and each remembered line seemed more exposed than the last, because all of it was true and none of it was guarded. She had written those unguarded words to a man she had never met, through letters that had begun only because of his sister. The letter still lay sealed and waiting for the post, but already it felt almost beyond recall. She got up and dressed and went down to breakfast because there was nothing else to be done, and if she did not go down, Lady Iris would notice that too. Lady Iris was already at the table. The morning was fine, the tea was poured, and Mrs. Ferrand had served eggs, slices of hot toast, and a little dish of butter. Lady Iris said something cheerful about the day and the plans for it. Mrs. March answered whenever an answer seemed expected. She lifted her teacup and held it for some time without drinking, and found that swallowing required attention. Through the small window of the breakfast room she could see the street, the draper's awning, and the road climbing up from the lower street. The postboy would come that way. Mrs. March watched for him over the rim of her cup, trying to look as though she were only drinking her tea and not waiting for the moment her letter would pass out of her hands. Once posted, the letter would go south, out of her reach, to Hampshire, and into the hands of a man who would read in her own unguarded hand more of her than she had ever meant to show. Chapter 7. A letter from Hampshire. Stoke Abney and the road to Ullswater. Her letter reached Stoke Abney on Friday afternoon, with the rest of the week's post and a bill from the saddler. Lord Marcus opened it at his desk before he looked at anything else, because over the past 2 months he had fallen into the habit of looking first through the post for her handwriting. Only when there was no sign of her handwriting did he turn to the rest. Today he found it. He recognized her hand at once. He had come to know it as one knows a familiar voice on the stairs before the door opens. He read it in the front parlour, where he conducted his magistrate's business and spent most of his daylight hours. It was a plain room. There were books along one wall, and the sessions papers were stacked neatly at one corner of the desk, where they always were. A window looked out over the garden, and behind him, on the wall he did not face when he was working, hung a portrait of his late brother. Edmund had been painted at 23, in a blue coat, with the half-smile of a man who has been told to hold still and does not mean to hold it long. The painter had caught that much of him. The rest of Edmund had gone before anyone had time to know him fully. Lord Marcus read her letter through once, quickly, the way one reads at first, only to discover what sort of letter it was. Then he sat for a moment with it in his hand, and read it again, slowly. It was not the usual sort. He had known that by the second line. Her other letters had been full of small, particular things. A room made vivid, a stranger caught in an odd sentence, a moment on the road set down so exactly that he could almost see it. He had liked those letters very much. He had not known until that afternoon how much of his week had come to be arranged around them. This was not that. She was telling him the truth while pretending to speak of someone else. She had been unable to be truly herself, and now, little by little, she was finding her way back. It hurt, and she had chosen to say so to him. He understood the device. He did not for a moment take it for a story about a woman she had known. He took it for exactly what it was. The most a careful person could say while leaving herself one small door for escape. He had done the same thing himself, in his life, more than once, though not in letters, and not to anyone for a long time. He sat with the letter for a long while. Outside the window, the garden shifted from gold to shadow, and he did not notice. A man came to the side gate about the saddler's bill, and one of the servants answered him. A strip of light crept along the edge of the desk. When he answered her, he wrote a shorter letter than hers.
Dear Mrs. March, I had your letter today and read it twice. I tell you that because it is true, and because I think this letter deserves the truth in return. I will not pretend I think you were writing about a woman you knew. I will not answer such trust by stepping around it. I will tell you something plainly, since you told me your truth sideways, and I think one of us ought to speak plainly. I had a brother. He was 7 years older than I, and better at nearly everything either of us attempted, which I say without bitterness. It was simply the case, and there was pleasure in calling such a man my brother. He died when I was 15. I will not tell you how tonight. It is not a thing I can set down on paper yet, nor a thing I can soften by pretending it belongs to someone else. I will only tell you that he died, and that for a very long time afterward, I could not enter any room in the house without feeling the shape of his absence there. Every doorway seemed to remember him. Every chair he had favoured, every book he had left unfinished, every room he might have entered and never would again, became a kind of memorial. I arranged a great deal of my life around the empty chair, the unused room, and the books he had never come back to finish, without noticing I was doing it. The way you describe putting a voice away and not understanding that keeping quiet is work until one stops. I did begin to come back to myself, in part, though it took me longer than it seems to have taken the woman you describe, and I cannot tell you how that came about either, because I do not altogether know. I know only that you are right about the pins and needles. It is exactly that. One is glad of it, but gladness does not make it gentle, and anyone who tells you the return of feeling is a gentle thing has not had much of it to return. I am glad you said it to me, rather than to no one. I would rather be the man trusted with such a letter than almost anything else I can think of at present, which is a sentence I have looked at for some time, and am going to let stand. Yours, Iris Bellamy.
He read it over once, as he always did. This time he did not cross anything out. He folded it, sealed it, and set it aside for the morning post. He did not write to his sister that day. By the time he had sealed the first letter, he knew he would go north. The decision had settled in him somewhere between the first reading and the second, without his noticing exactly when it had happened. But a magistrate and landowner did not leave Hampshire simply because he had sealed a letter. The August sessions must be entrusted to another magistrate, or postponed. Pelham must be written to about the estate. The matter of the Hartfield boundary could not be left unresolved halfway through the hearing. There was the house, the servants, the tenants, and the 100 small habits of 6 years, each one needing to be set in order before he could leave. He would write to Iris when he could give her a date, not merely an intention. A letter promising to come, without naming when, would only set Iris arranging things around a date he did not yet have, and Iris arranged quite enough as it was, usually before anyone else had understood there was anything to arrange. So he let that letter wait. It would be written within the week when the sessions were settled and he could name a day. For the present, he stood at the window and looked out at the Hampshire garden, with her letter still lying open in his mind. He had looked out at that garden every day for 6 years, until it had grown so familiar he had almost ceased to see it. That afternoon he no longer looked at it for peace. He looked past it, and in his mind the road north had already begun. His letter reached them in Buxton on the morning of their departure. It came with the early post. While the trunks and boxes were being brought down, Mrs. Ferrand was being thanked and Lady Iris settled the account. Mrs. Ferrand placed it in Mrs. March's hand in the narrow hall. It was the moment Mrs. March had awaited all the previous morning, with equal dread and longing. By then a day had worn the dread down, and when she saw the handwriting on the outer fold, what remained was mostly longing. She did not open it there. She tucked it beneath the edge of her glove, where the folded paper touched her wrist, went out to the carriage, and sat very still while the trunks were strapped on. She did not open it until Buxton was behind them and the road had begun to climb. Then she broke the seal. She read it once quickly, only to learn how he had answered her. Then she went back to the top and read it again, slowly. The second time she had to stop in 2 places and look out of the window at the hills before she could go on, not because she failed to understand it, but because she understood it too well.
I will not pretend I think you were writing about a woman you knew.
He had known at once that the unnamed woman in her letter was no stranger. He had seen through the disguise and met her honesty with his own. Then, because he would not let her stand alone in such openness, he had placed his own truth beside hers and told her about his brother. He had stopped exactly where she had stopped, at the edge of the story he could not yet set down on paper. He had met her honesty, and then gone one step further than she had dared, on purpose, so that she should not be the only one standing there. She read,
I would rather be the man trusted with such a letter than almost anything else I can think of.
3 times, and then folded the letter, because afterward there were only 2 places to look: the window or Lady Iris, and neither would hide her. The window was no refuge. Her face was already turned toward it. Lady Iris looked up from her book.
You have been a long time over that.
It is nothing of consequence.
The pause came before she could stop it.
Only a letter.
Ah.
Said Lady Iris. That was all she said. She did not ask from whom. She did not look at the outside of the folded letter, though it lay within reach. She turned a page of her book which Mrs. March noticed she had not turned in some time, and looked out of her own window at the countryside. She left the matter alone with a tact so complete that it said more than questions would have done. Mrs. March, sitting opposite her with the letter growing warm in her hand, understood only that Lady Iris had seen more than she said, and had chosen generously to say nothing. The road climbed out of the Derbyshire valleys and into stonier country. The fields lost their brightness, and the hedges gave way to dry stone walls, their stones laid without mortar, running up the hills in long, pale lines until they disappeared beyond the ridges. The villages grew fewer, with longer stretches of open road between them. The horses were changed at small posting houses, little roadside inns with scarcely more than a yard, a stable, and a signboard. The afternoon was long and bright. Light came in at the window, crossed the carriage floor, touched the opposite seat, and slid away as the road turned. Mrs. March sat through all of it with the writing case in her lap and the letter hidden inside it, her hand flat on the lid of the case, the way one keeps a hand on something precious, half afraid of losing it and half afraid to call it one's own. She did not read it again. She did not need to. By the second reading she knew it almost by heart. His words stayed with her like the pins and needles he had written about. Not comfortable, and yet nothing she would have given up. Lady Iris slept for a time, or gave the appearance of doing so. The country grew wilder and higher, with long empty stretches that were beautiful in a way Mrs. March had no name for. She watched the landscape unfold, mile by mile, her hand still resting on the case. Then, in the late afternoon, the carriage came over a long rise, and the horses slowed at the top of it. Far below them, held in a fold of the darkening hills, the first gleam of water caught the last of the sun. They came to the house on the shore of Ullswater in the early evening, with the light going gold along the water and the hills standing up dark behind it. It was a small house, and old, and built of the grey stone of the country, with a slate roof gone the colour of the hills in rain, and a garden that did not so much end as give up, part way down the slope, and become the shore. There was a quality to the quiet of the place that was different in kind from Buxton's. Buxton had been high and bare and indifferent. This was low and held and full of water sound. The small, constant work of the lake against the stones at the foot of the garden, under everything, the way the wind had been under everything on the moor. The housekeeper was a Mrs. Aketh, a spare grey woman of the district who said little and had everything ready. There was tea laid in the small drawing-room, where the window looked straight out upon the lake, and bread, and a seed cake, and the fire lit though it was August, because the evenings came off the water cold even in August, and Mrs. Aketh knew her house. They sat down to it gratefully. Mrs. March was tired in the pleasant way of a long day's travelling toward something rather than away from it, and for a while neither of them said much, and the lake went on with its small work outside the window, and it was very nearly possible to believe the journey had no end in it but this. Then Lady Iris, buttering a piece of seed cake, said,
I had a note from Marcus this morning. He comes on Friday.
She said it lightly, and to the seed cake, in the tone of a woman remembering a small domestic fact among other small domestic facts, and she did not look up while she said it. And she had timed it, though no one watching could have proved she had timed it, for the precise moment when the tea had been poured and the fire had taken, and her companion's guard had gone down with the long day, so that the news arrived not as an announcement but as the most ordinary thing in the world, which was exactly the disguise it needed to do its work. It was managed very gently. So gently indeed that only afterward, lying awake, did Mrs. March understand that it had happened at all, and by whose hand, and how long it had been quietly in motion. For a moment Mrs. March did not say anything. The water sound went on outside the window. Lady Iris ate her seed cake and did not appear to be waiting for an answer, which was its own way of waiting for one. At last, with great care to make her answer sound quite casual, Mrs. March said,
How lovely.
Yes, it is,
said Lady Iris comfortably, as though that settled it, and went on to say something about Mrs. Aketh, and the trout the lake was supposed to be famous for, and whether the boat that came with the house was sound enough to be trusted with 2 women and a magistrate, and the moment closed over, as smoothly as the lake closed over a thrown stone, with nothing left on the surface to show where it had gone in. Mrs. March sat through the rest of the tea and answered in the right places. She had become, over 2 months, quite good at answering in the right places, while the larger part of her was occupied elsewhere. It was a thing the year before this one had taught her, and the only thing from that year she was glad to have kept. When the tea was done, she said that the day had tired her more than she had thought, which was true, and that she would go up, which was also true, and Lady Iris said good night without looking at her in any particular way, which Mrs. March was grateful for and did not yet know to be deliberate. Her room was at the top of the house, under the slate, small and white and plain, with a window that stood open to the evening. She did not light the candle. There was light enough still from the window. She set the writing case down on the bed. She had kept her hand upon it all the afternoon, noticing herself do it and not stopping. Then she stood at the open window, looked out, and there was the lake. It lay below the garden, almost dark now, with the last of the light gone thin and silver along the middle of it, and the hills black on the far side. And it was very large, and very quiet, and entirely indifferent to her, in the way that large, quiet things are, which she found she did not mind. She stood there a long time. Friday was 3 days off. He would come up that same dark water of road out of the south that she had come up, and the man whose hand she had read by candlelight in inn after inn, whose 2 months of letters were in the case on the bed behind her, the man who had reached straight through her third person and stood in the open so that she should not stand there alone, that man would be in this house in a room on Friday, and she would have to look at him with her face, and her face had only ever had to manage paper. She stood at the window until the silver went off the water and the lake and the sky were the same colour, and she could not have said where the one stopped and the other began. Then she turned back into the small white room and began, slowly, to undress for bed. There were still 3 days to decide how she would meet him, and all at once 3 days seemed a dangerously small amount of time. Chapter 8. Ullswater, Friday. He came by hired chaise on Friday in the early afternoon. They heard the wheels on the road above the house some time before the chaise came into view. Lady Iris had been at the window for the better part of an hour, making very little pretence of attending to anything else. When the chaise turned in from the road, she was out of the room and into the hall before Mrs. March had got up. Mrs. March did get up. For a moment she stood with one hand on the back of her chair, in the small drawing-room with the bright lake at her back, and heard the wheels stop and the chaise door open, and Lady Iris's voice lift in the way it did when she was glad and not minding who knew it. Then came a man's lower voice, saying something brief that made Lady Iris laugh. There was nothing to do but go out into the hall, so she went. Lady Iris had taken both his hands and stepped back to look at him, telling him the sun had got at him more than she had ever seen, and that Hampshire evidently agreed with him better than London ever had. He stood patiently under her gaze, like a man long accustomed to this particular form of affection. Then, over Lady Iris's shoulder, he saw Mrs. March come into the hall, and his attention shifted from his sister, though he did not interrupt her. During the 3 days before his arrival, Mrs. March had thought she knew what he would be, because she had known him for 2 months on paper and had made a portrait of him from his letters. The portrait had been wrong in the way such portraits are always wrong. The details had been there, but not the living man. He was tall, taller than she had allowed for, so that the small hall seemed smaller around him, though he made no effort to command it. He was sunbrowned from a summer out of doors, and the colour of his skin made his blue-grey eyes seem lighter than they might otherwise have done. There were fine lines at the outer corners, which might have come from sun or laughter, and made his composed face seem less severe. His face was long, with a strong jaw, and a faint cleft in the chin. His dark hair was worn a little longer than the fashion, and did not lie quite neatly. His mouth was composed and faintly amused at one corner, not at anything in particular, but as a settled habit of the face. He wore a plain dark blue coat, correct without being fashionable, as though he cared enough to be proper and no more. None of it was what she had pictured. All of it was instantly, disconcertingly more particular than any picture could be. A living person in a doorway, tall and sun-browned, with a manner of standing all his own, where there had been only handwriting on paper and a voice she had imagined while she read. She had spent 2 months, she understood in that moment, being perfectly easy with a man who did not exist. The man who did exist was in the hall, 8 feet away, and had just turned his full attention to her. His look was perfectly courteous, and for that very reason she found it almost impossible to meet. Lady Iris, still bright, made the introductions.
Mrs. March, my brother Marcus. Marcus, Mrs. March, of whom you have heard a very great deal.
I have,
He said. He came forward, bowed, and put out his hand. She gave him hers. They shook hands with the formality of strangers, which in every ordinary sense they were. His hand was warm and dry, his grasp brief, and he released her hand at just the proper moment.
I am glad to meet you at last,
He said. He said it in a voice she seemed already to know, because for 2 months she had imagined one for his letters. But her version had been a guess, and this was the real voice, lower than she had made it, with a quiet kindness she had not known how to imagine. The difference startled her more than it ought to have done, and she was grateful that custom required so few words from her in reply that even she could not get them wrong.
I am pleased to meet you, my lord. You have had a long journey.
I have. It improved considerably when the hills came into view.
His eyes rested on Mrs. March as he said it, just long enough to make the words feel less entirely about the hills. Then, seeing that she had no answer ready, he turned to his sister and asked whether the house suited her. Lady Iris swept them into the drawing-room. Tea was brought in almost at once, because Mrs. Acuth had heard the chaise too and knew her business. The three of them sat down to oatcakes and good butter, while the fire burned beside them, welcome even in August. Lady Iris led the conversation, which was a mercy. When she did, the other two needed only to be present and occasionally agree. Mrs. March could do that, and did. Lord Marcus sat where the light from the window fell across him, answering his sister and drinking his tea. He seemed entirely at his ease in a room with two women. His sister, whom he had known all his life, and Mrs. March, whom he had first seen only 20 minutes before. Once, while Lady Iris was pouring his second cup and telling him at length why the lake's famous trout were not to be had that day, he looked across at Mrs. March, not for long, and not openly enough for Lady Iris to see while she was busy with the teapot. But the look held none of the polite distance his words had so carefully preserved. He had not known what he expected to find in Mrs. March's face. Her letters had given him a mind, a temper, a courage she herself perhaps did not know she had, but they had given him no proper likeness. She was beautiful, and the fact of it unsettled him more than he would have liked. Not because it was a showy beauty or the sort that asked to be admired, but because it seemed to belong to everything he already knew of her, the reserve, the intelligence, the feeling held carefully back. She was quieter in person than on the page, and more carefully held together, not cold, not distant, only guarded in a way that made him wish to take very great care. Then the look was gone. He was thanking his sister for the tea, and beyond the window Ullswater lay bright and enormous in the August afternoon, stretching away between its hills, untouched by whatever had shifted in the small, warm room. They dined at 5 at the small table in the room overlooking the lake. Mrs. Acuth had managed to find trout, despite Lady Iris's insistence that no trout was to be had on a Friday, and there were new potatoes with butter and a little mint, and afterward a dish of raspberries with cream so thick it had to be spooned rather than poured. The lake had gone from bright to pewter while they ate, and then to a deepening grey, and the candles were lit before the meal was over, without anyone remarking on it. With the candles lit and the view beyond the windows darkening, the table became the bright centre of the room, though a little of the day still lingered beyond the glass. At the table, Lord Marcus treated Mrs. March with the careful courtesy due to a new acquaintance. He spoke to her as though he admired her already, but never let his attention rest on her long enough to make her uneasy. He asked her nothing that 2 months of letters had already answered. He did not say, as you wrote or you will recall you told me. He did not, by word or glance, let anyone at the table know that there was any acquaintance between them before that afternoon. He did it so well that twice she half believed it herself, and was steadied by it, and understood, somewhere amid the passing of plates, the pouring of wine, and Lady Iris's running commentary on the countryside they had crossed. But the steadiness was deliberate, offered to her on purpose, the way one quietly draws a chair near for someone tired, and says nothing about having done it. It was when the raspberries had been taken away that he reached down beside his chair and turned to Lady Iris.
I brought you something. It is not for any particular occasion. I have had it ready since the spring, waiting for the right moment to give it to you.
It was a book. He set it quietly by her plate, without making a ceremony of it. It was an old Robinson Crusoe, much read, newly rebound in plain dark leather without tooling or gilt, a sturdy, unshowy binding, made to last. When Lady Iris opened the cover, she found Henry's name inside it, written in the careful hand of a boy. She turned a page, and then another. Here and there in the margins were his marks, a line drawn beside a passage he had liked, a question in the corner of a page, one small, emphatic nonsense written beside something he had plainly not believed. For a moment she did not move. Lady Iris turned the book over in her hands, then back again, and ran her thumb once along the new spine. She did not trust herself to speak, and did not try to, and Lord Marcus let her be silent. He kept his eyes on the tablecloth and did not watch her face. The candle flames stood steady in the still room, and the lake lay fully dark beyond the window. Mrs. March sat a little apart from the two of them, hands quiet in her lap, careful not to intrude on what passed between brother and sister. That was when she understood what the gift had shown her about him. She had spent a year, more than a year, having her own grief handled by people who meant well. She knew exactly what it was to be told one was sorry, and to be asked how one went on in a voice that wanted the answer to be better, and to be given things at the wrong time by people who needed the giving more than she needed the gift, so that she had been made, again and again, to manage their kindness on top of everything else she had to bear. She had learned that lesson too thoroughly ever to forget it. And here was a man who had thought, for the better part of a year, not about the gift but about the hour for it, who had carried the newly bound book all the long way north, and had kept silent about it in every letter he wrote, waiting for a moment quiet enough to place it in her hands, who, having given it, looked at the tablecloth so that she need not be watched while she could not speak. It was not merely that he was kind. Many people had been kind to her, and she had learned how heavily kindness could fall when it was clumsily given. What moved her was that he understood the shape of it. He knew when to speak, when to be silent, when to offer the thing itself, and when to look away. He had chosen the gentler course before she had even dared hope for it. When the air came back into her lungs, she realized she had been holding her breath, though she could not have said when it had begun. Perhaps when he looked down at the tablecloth. Perhaps when she understood why. Her chest ached slightly with the holding, and the first breath back was almost painful. Lady Iris put the book in her lap, both hands flat on it, and looked at her brother.
Thank you,
She said, in a voice thinned almost to nothing. Lord Marcus said,
Well,
Lady Iris seemed to understand him. Then he reached for the wine, and little by little the three of them returned to dinner, with the lake lying entirely dark outside. After dinner, Lady Iris declared that the room had grown too close and that they must have a little air before the evening settled in. They went out through the drawing-room door onto the narrow stone terrace above the garden, where the lake lay darkening below them, and the first coolness was coming off the water. Lady Iris settled herself there for perhaps 10 minutes, long enough to make it seem accidental and not long enough to be mistaken for endurance. Then, without fuss, in the manner of a woman carrying out a plan she had already completed in her own mind, she rose and said the day had been longer than she had allowed for, and that the journey was telling on her at last.
I shall leave you to the evening. Marcus, you must not keep Mrs. March standing in the cold air too long.
I shall keep her here no longer than she wishes.
Lady Iris received this with quiet satisfaction, as if matters were proceeding exactly as she had intended, and went in. It was not until Lady Iris had gone in, and the house had settled behind her, that Mrs. March understood she was alone with him, truly alone, for the first time since he had ceased to be only handwriting and become a man before her. The terrace was a flagged strip along the lakeside of the house, with a low wall at the end of it and the garden falling away beyond into the dark. The light was nearly gone. Below the garden, the lake was no longer water one could properly see, but a broad darkness, faintly moving, with the last grey draining out of the sky behind the hills on the far side, and the first stars coming small and uncertain above the black line of them. It was very quiet. At the foot of the garden, the lake lapped softly against the stones, a small, steady sound beneath the silence. They stood at the low wall. For a little while he spoke of the journey, the road, the change of horses at Penrith, and how the country had grown wilder and more beautiful as he came north. His voice was easy and asked nothing of her. She answered, and after a time found herself speaking of the lake instead, of how it had looked from her window when they came, of the way the light had gone off it the first evening, and left the water and the sky the same colour, with no seam between them. She had not meant to say so much. She heard herself saying it and did not stop, because they stood just beyond the candlelight from the windows, and the dark was a kind of shelter. He did not fill the silences which made it easier still. When she had finished, he was quiet for a moment, looking out toward the dark water. He did not mean to press her. Indeed, he did not know enough to press. Iris had told him only that Mrs. March was a widow, and that she had come to her after a difficult year, needing quiet, useful employment and room to recover herself. That was all. It was not enough to explain the way Mrs. March sometimes went still at the edge of an answer, or the way she guarded certain silences as if they were all that remained to her. He did not know what her husband had been, or what her marriage had cost her, or whether the grief she carried was simple grief at all. He knew only that there was pain there, and that tenderness, if it was to be any use at all, must wait until she chose to speak. Still, after a while he said quietly,
"Forgive me. You need not answer. But may I ask what happened to Mr. March?"
Mrs. March's hand tightened on the cold stone of the wall. For a moment she could not speak. Then she said,
"It is late, my lord."
He heard the refusal in it. Perhaps he heard more than that. Something in his face altered, only a little, but enough.
"Yes, it is late."
He did not ask again. He did not apologize in a way that would require her to forgive him. He only stood beside her in the dark for another moment, and then said,
"I have kept you in the cold air too long after all, and Iris will say I am not to be trusted. Shall I take you in?"
"No, thank you. I shall come in presently."
He looked at her for a moment, not pressing, not pretending not to understand. Then he bowed his head.
"I shall not be far."
He crossed the terrace and went in, and the candlelight from the drawing-room fell in a long, pale shape across the flags behind her. She stayed where she was, at the low wall, with the dark lake below the garden and the cold coming up through the stone. What happened to Mr. March? The question remained after Marcus had gone in. He did not know what had happened to Thomas. Not truly. But he had asked the question she most feared, and she had stepped back from it too quickly for him not to understand that the answer was not simple. In the morning there would be a chaise to be had, if she wanted one. Somewhere beyond Kendal there was a cousin of her mother's, a woman she had never met but whose name had once been given to her as a possible refuge. She had enough money now for the fare, if she was careful. She could be gone before Marcus came down to breakfast, leaving a letter for Lady Iris that she would spend the rest of her life unable to forgive herself for. The truth would go with her, untold and safe, and that would be the end of it. She would have fled from him as she had fled from everyone else, only this time from the one person who had not deserved it. Or she could stay. She stood at the wall a long time, with the lake moving below her in the dark and the candlelight behind her on the stones. She did not decide. Not yet. She only stood there with Friday over, the whole of the next day waiting, and his question still between her and the house. Chapter 9. 3 at the table. Ullswater, the days following. By morning, she had not gone. No chaise was ordered. No letter was left for Lady Iris. She did not set out toward the unknown cousin beyond Kendal. Mrs. March came down to breakfast, and for that morning it was enough. Lord Marcus did not mention the question on the terrace. That was the mercy of it, and also the difficulty. He had let her know that he understood more than she had meant him to understand, and then he had let the matter rest. He did not speak of the letters. He did not press her by word or look. He only went on as he had before, courteous, patient, and apparently content to leave the next word to her. 4 days passed like that, or 5. Afterward she could not have said how many, because one had blurred into the next. To anyone watching they would have looked like pleasant days, but they gave her none of a pleasant day's ease. The 3 of them walked in the mornings, while the dew was still on the grass at the foot of the garden. They went along the shore, up into the woods behind the house, and once a long way round by a small stream that Mrs. Aketh, with local certainty, had called a beck. It came down from the fell, which was what she called the high open hill above the woods, in a run of little cascades. They went out one afternoon in the boat belonging to the house, Lord Marcus at the oars, and Lady Iris trailing one hand in the water and pronouncing the lake too cold to drown in comfortably, which she said she found reassuring. After dinner, they sat in the small room with the fire that was welcome even in August, and Lady Iris talked, and Lord Marcus said what little he chose to say. And Mrs. March sat with her work in her lap and looked, to anyone watching, like the person she had promised herself in the spring she would be. A companion, useful and quiet, attending to Lady Iris with proper care. Yet all the while she was listening for the thing he did not say. She had braced herself for something else, for a man who knew she had been writing of herself to press his advantage, to ask again, to make silence impossible. But he had asked the one question she could not answer, and then left her the dignity of not answering it. Now she feared he would refer to it somehow. A look, a careful turn of phrase, would require her answer, and then what had passed between them must either go forward or end. She had readied herself for that, as one readies for pain when the blow has already begun to fall. It did not come. Instead, he behaved as though the question on the terrace had not happened. He was courteous to her only as a man is courteous to his sister's companion, and not 1 degree more. He made no attempt to find her alone. He did not look at her in any way that Lady Iris, had she been as oblivious as she chose to appear, could have remarked. He had said the one thing, on the one evening, and then had simply stopped. He waited without a word, without so much as a look that asked anything of her. It was the absence of demand that undid her by degrees, because she could have stood against pressure if she had been able to see its shape, but there was no word or gesture she could push against, only another courteous day after the last. He was not laying siege to her. He was doing something far harder to defend against. He had asked once, and then stepped back. What made it worse, and blurred the days together, was that she could not always tell when he was waiting for her to speak. She felt it most at meals. Lady Iris would be talking, and in one of her pauses, Lord Marcus would offer some small remark to the table. It would sound almost like something Mrs. March had once written to him. Not a quotation, never near enough to be a quotation. He was too careful for that, and she suspected she was listening too carefully. Only a familiar turn of thought, a familiar way of seeing a thing. Once, speaking of the weather coming over the far fell, he said it looked like rain that had taken offence, and she had written him something not unlike that about a storm over Buxton. She sat with her fork still, and did not know, could not for her life have told, whether he had said it because she had written something like it, or because it was simply the sort of dry remark he might make about weather. And she had once said it too because they had both seen the same small thing in nearly the same way, which was the whole trouble, and had been from the second letter. There was no way to test it. To ask would be to confess she had heard the echo. To show she had heard it would be to confess everything. So she let each one go by, and the uncertainty rose in her across the days like water in a low room, not fast enough at any moment to frighten her, only never going down. Lady Iris, through all of it, remained determinedly cheerful. She was bright at breakfast, lively on the walks, and full of conversation in the evenings while Mrs. March sat with her sewing. She admired the lake, and made Lord Marcus row her to the island and back, and told long, excellent stories about people in London, asking nothing of her listeners but the occasional nod. For 3 days Mrs. March accepted Lady Iris's cheerfulness for what it seemed to be. On the 4th, the truth showed itself over the work table. Lady Iris was winding silk while Mrs. March sorted her thread, and Lord Marcus stood by the fire with a book in his hand. They had been speaking of letters, quite safely at first, the post, the roads, the difficulty of writing in a moving carriage. Then Lord Marcus said, very lightly, that some letters told more than their writers intended. Mrs. March felt her needle pause. The words were innocent enough. It was the ease with which he spoke them, and the particular silence that followed, which was not. She looked carefully at Lady Iris. Lady Iris knew, of course, that they had corresponded. There was no discovery in that. But another woman might have marked the look between them, the sudden stillness, the private sense that had entered the room. Lady Iris did neither. She only wound the silk once more about the card, looked at the fire, and let the moment pass. That was when Mrs. March understood. Lady Iris had not failed to notice what the letters had made possible between them. She was not interfering. She was standing back, with all the tact in the world, and leaving Mrs. March to choose her own moment. Near the end of a long walk on that fourth day, she found herself behind the two of them. They had gone further than they had meant to, round by the beck and up into a fold of the hills where there was a ruined shepherd's hut, and beyond it, on turf cropped close by sheep, stood a rough ring of low grey stones, so old that none of them could have guessed its age. Lord Marcus had wanted to see it. Lady Iris had not, and then liked it better than either of them did. Coming back, the path narrowed to single file as it went down through the bracken, and Lord Marcus went first because of the rough ground, reaching back to offer his hand to his sister at the steep places, and Lady Iris went second, talking back over her shoulder, and Mrs. March came last, a little apart, as a companion does. At the bottom there was a stile. The other two were over it, and a little way along the level path beyond, before Mrs. March reached it. She stopped there, with her hand on the cold top bar of the stile, not climbing it yet, and stood and watched them go on ahead of her in the late gold light. Lord Marcus with his coat over his arm, and his head a little inclined to hear whatever his sister was saying, Lady Iris gesturing in the way she did when she was enjoying her own story. The two of them comfortable together in the way of people who have known each other all their lives. They did not know she had paused. That was all. There was no unkindness in it, no neglect. Nothing in the afternoon had suggested she was being left behind. She had made herself quiet. She had made herself useful. She had trained herself, almost without noticing, to take up as little space as possible. And now, standing with her hand on the stile, she saw how well she had succeeded. Ahead of her, Lord Marcus and Lady Iris moved through the late gold light, easy with one another, not knowing she had stopped. And there, with her hand cold on the wood, Mrs. March knew she could not go on as she had been, not for the weeks left of summer, not even for another 4 days. She had meant to be useful and quiet. She had meant to want nothing, ask nothing, and keep herself safe. But safety had begun to feel like silence, and silence had begun to feel like a kind of death. Marcus had given her a choice and refused to make it for her. Lady Iris had seen more than she said and held her peace. Both of them, with their terrible patience, were leaving it to her. She put her other hand on the bar. Then, after another moment in the gold light, she climbed over the stile and went down the path after them. Lady Iris contrived, the next morning, to have Mrs. March to herself, while making it look entirely accidental. She had decided over breakfast that the boat ought to be kept another week. She had been very firm on the matter, and had sent Marcus down to the village to ask whether it could be arranged. After he had left, Lady Iris put her arm through Mrs. March's in the hall, as if nothing particular were intended, and said they ought to walk in the garden before the day grew hot. It was a modest garden. It went down the slope behind the house in 2 rough terraces of grass, with a gravel path between beds already past their best. Below that, the garden gave way to the shore. They walked down the path. The lake was flat and pale and enormous below them, and the morning was very still. For a little while Lady Iris talked of trifles, the boat, the weather, a letter she owed Sophronia, and had no intention of writing. She talked in her easy, flowing way. Mrs. March answered when she was expected to answer, until they came to the turn of the path at the bottom where the gravel ended. There Lady Iris stopped walking.
"My dear,"
she said, looking out at the water rather than at Mrs. March,
"you must know my brother is very much attached to you. He has been for some time."
Mrs. March's hand remained on Lady Iris's arm. She heard herself answer with the only reply she knew how to give.
Lady Iris, I think you have mistaken him. I am his sister's companion. He has been very civil to me, as he would be to anyone in your household.
"Please do not,"
Lady Iris said, not sharply, but with quiet firmness.
"You may say a great many things to me and I will hear them kindly, but do not tell me he is merely civil, when we both know better."
She turned then, on the gravel, and looked at her.
"I have known since the second letter that there was more in it than courtesy. Whenever you answered one of his letters, he answered yours almost at once. These 2 months of letters have made my brother more himself than I have seen him in years. And I have seen how you listen for the post, my dear."
Mrs. March did not answer. There was nothing left for her to say that would not betray her.
I do not mean to press you.
Lady Iris went on, more quietly now, the brightness gone from her voice.
I do not ask what has been said, and I do not ask what you mean to do. That is your affair, not mine. But I must say one thing, and then I will leave you to consider it.
She paused.
You are afraid, Henrietta. I have watched you these 3 months, and I know what fear looks like when it is trying to call itself sense. But Marcus is a better man than your fear is letting you believe. Whatever you decide, do not let fear be the only counsel you take. That is all. That is what I came down the garden to say.
She let go of Mrs. March's arm.
I shall go in,
she said, with deliberate lightness.
It is going to be too hot for sensible people out here within the hour, and I owe a letter to Sophronia that I have avoided quite long enough. Stay as long as you like. The lake is very fine this morning, if one can attend to it.
She went back up the gravel path between the beds already past their best, unhurried and without looking back. Mrs. March stood at the turn where the gravel ended and the shore began. The flat, pale water lay before her. Above her, the house was quiet. For a long time, she could not make herself move in either direction. She did not go in after Lady Iris. She stayed where she was, until the sun was off the lower garden and the morning had worn into the flat middle of the day. Then she went straight to her own room, shut the door, and meant only to sit and think. She got as far as taking out a sheet of paper. Then, almost before she had decided what she meant to do, she had begun. She wrote the marriage as it had been. She wrote how Thomas had used his cleverness against her, how he corrected her, diminished her, laughed at what mattered to her, and made her feel foolish for speaking at all. She wrote of the years of it, and of the tiredness that came from learning, day after day, that her own voice cost more than it was worth. Then she wrote the part she had never been able to tell Lord Marcus, the part that had silenced her every time it came near. She did not explain it away or soften it. She set it down as plainly as she could. Setting it down did not break her. She had been certain for a year that it would, and that certainty had been part of why she had never done it. But the words sat there on the page, in her own hand, and she was still in the room. The lake still moved outside the window, indifferent, as it had before she wrote the words and would after. She folded the letter while the ink was scarcely dry and sealed it with the plain wax. She meant to give it to him. For a few minutes, sitting with it sealed in both hands, she believed she would. He was not far away in Hampshire now. He was under the same roof and would be across a table from her within the hour. She had only to carry the letter downstairs, wait until they were alone, and put it into his hand, but the courage that had been enough for writing was not yet enough for that. She set the letter on the desk and sat looking at it. It was not a refusal, not yet, but neither was it the act she had imagined. It remained there, sealed and waiting, while the candle burned low beside it. At last she snuffed the candle, put her hands to her hair in the small looking-glass, and went down, because supper would be laid. She had not been brave enough to give him the letter, but she would not hide from him for the rest of the evening. They were just sitting down when she came in. Lady Iris was settling herself and saying something about the cold off the lake at this hour and whether the fire was wanted. The soup had not yet been served. Nothing in the room had changed. The change had happened upstairs, alone, with a sealed letter on a desk. Below it was only supper, and she was only a little later to the table than she might have been, and not late enough for anyone to remark upon it. For 5 evenings she had sat across from him at this table and managed it by not quite looking, by attending to her plate, her glass, the safe distance between them. Then she raised her eyes to answer a question Lady Iris had turned to ask, and her gaze crossed the table and met his. He was already looking at her, not in any way Lady Iris could have remarked upon, absorbed as she was in her story. There was no demand in it, only a quiet recognition, entirely without the polite distance the table required. He had kept that distance so perfectly for 5 days that twice she had nearly believed it real. Now, for the length of a held breath, he simply did not pretend, and she found she could not look away. She had spent a year making a science of looking away. She tried to do it now, out of long habit, and could not. His look held hers across the candlelight, while Lady Iris's voice went on unbroken. Upstairs in her room, the letter she would never give him lay sealed on the desk beside the spent candle. Every word of it was in her own hand. Down here she sat in the warm light with the truth still unspoken and yet, suddenly, impossible to hide. She looked back at him and did not look away. She did not know what she would do next, or when, or how. But she was finished with the idea of leaving. That much, at least, was certain. The letter was still upstairs, sealed and waiting. So was the truth. Chapter 10. By the lake. Ullswater, the next afternoon. Lady Iris looked up from the book open in her lap and said the light was very fine along the shore, and that someone ought to admire it before the evening closed in. She herself was far too idle to be dragged about the lake, she said, and would remain exactly where she was. Lord Marcus turned to Mrs. March at once.
Will you walk with me?
Mrs. March felt Lady Iris lower her eyes to her book. The request was perfectly ordinary, and yet it seemed to ask more of her than a walk.
Yes, I should like that.
They went down through the lower garden to the lakeshore, then turned along the water. It was a still afternoon, gone gold. The far hills lay reflected in the lake, upside down and unbroken, so that there seemed to be twice as much sky and hillside, and all of it quiet. They walked without saying much. The path ran close to the water, first over shingle and then over turf, with the alders coming down to the edge. In places they went single file, then came abreast again. She had braced for him to speak of Mr. March, of the question he had asked on the terrace, and the answer she had not given. He had let it rest all week, but she had never stopped feeling it there between them. He did not.
I had a brother.
He said it simply, looking ahead along the path.
Edmund, older than I by a good deal. I was 15 when he was killed.
Mrs. March looked at him then, startled into sympathy, but he did not look back. She understood that he was not asking for comfort, only gathering himself to go on. So she said nothing, and for a little while they walked on in silence. The path narrowed at the alders, and they went single file a little way, and did not speak, and came abreast again where it widened.
He was killed in a duel over a card table, and words that should never have been spoken, much less answered as they were. They went out the next morning. By evening, the other man had taken passage for Ireland and was never brought to account. Those who could have pursued it did not, and the law has never had much stomach for pursuing a gentleman who has killed another in an arranged duel.
The lake lay gold and enormous, and held the hills without moving. They walked on a little.
My father was never the same after it. He lived 5 more years, but the house had changed by then, and so had he. By 20, Stoke Abney was mine, before I knew what to do with it. Some years later, I was asked to serve as magistrate for the division. I accepted and have done it 15 years.
He was quiet a moment.
I suppose I wanted, in my own small way, to see that the law did not always look away.
The path curved beneath a rowan tree near the water, and he slowed. A wooden bench was set back beneath it, with the whole western reach of the lake beyond and the sun beginning, at last, to go down toward the hills.
Will you sit a moment?
She did. He did not sit too close to her. He took the other end of the bench, leaving the proper space between them, and for a little while they looked out over the water.
I have lived very quietly these 6 years, since my wife died. That is not the story I mean to tell this afternoon. I say it only so you understand that I had grown used to being alone and had not expected that to change.
He stopped on the turf and looked at her, the first time since he had begun.
I am telling you all of this so that you know who is walking beside you, not a stranger who has merely been civil to you for a week, a man who has known grief and violence and the failure of justice. If there is a hard truth to tell, Mrs. March, I am the last man in England you need fear telling it to. I did not want you deciding in the dark.
He had not asked for her story. Instead, he had offered his own, plainly and without demand, and left the choice with her. They sat on the bench. For a little while neither of them spoke. The light was leaving the water now, and the far shore had begun to lose its edges. He looked at the lake and let the quiet remain.
You asked me once what happened to Mr. March, on the terrace, the first evening you arrived.
I should not have.
No, you should have. I have wanted someone to ask for a long time, though I was afraid of what I would have to answer.
She had her hands in her lap, and she looked at them, then at the water.
I will tell you now. I would rather tell it badly than not at all, so you must let me tell it as it comes, even if it is not the right order.
Tell it in any order you like.
Thomas did not die as people suppose. He was killed. I have let everyone believe otherwise, Lady Iris among them, because it was easier to leave the truth unspoken. But he was shot in a duel early one morning, in the way such things are done.
The sun sank a little lower toward the hills. He did not say anything. He had gone very still beside her. She had learned by now that this was how he listened.
He was a clever man, and a hard one. The marriage was not happy, but that is not the part I must tell you now. I can say that much plainly enough. What I have never been able to say is what came after. I do not know how to tell it clearly, even now. But I would rather tell it badly than keep it back again.
She stopped. The light thinned. A bird crossed the water and disappeared into the dark trees beyond.
Thomas was killed in a duel too. You know something of that particular cruelty. There had been a quarrel. That was what I was told afterward, by people who told me as little as they could, and were relieved that I asked so little. I did not ask. I want you to hear that plainly. It is not to my credit. They let me believe the duel had been fought over a matter of honour, and that the other man had been wronged. They let me believe Thomas had gone out knowing himself to be in the wrong, because the alternative was exposure, that he would rather take his chance at dawn with a pistol in his hand than be known for what he had done. I accepted that account because it was easier than asking more. I was afraid of what I might learn, and fear allowed ignorance to feel like mercy.
She was quiet a moment. He let her be.
The man who killed him was my cousin, my mother's sister's son. We spent our summers in the same house as children.
She stopped. The sun was almost into the hills now, and the gold was nearly gone off the water. Then she said the name she had never allowed herself to speak aloud.
My cousin Edward Halford.
She did not look at him as she said it. She looked at the lake. He did not move and did not speak. She had said the name aloud at last, and still she was there.
I do not know the whole truth of the duel, but I know more than I have allowed myself to admit. When you told me about your brother and asked nothing of me in return, I found I could no longer look away from my own past.
She drew a breath.
Edward had a wife. I knew her very little. She married him after I had married Thomas, and we met perhaps 4 times. I know that Thomas spent a great deal of time in their part of the county that last year, on business he did not explain. By then I had stopped asking about anything of his. When it was over, no one of my family would meet my eye. It was given out as a quarrel over cards, and I let it be cards. Cards were easy to believe. A man may die stupidly over cards. The harder truth was that Thomas had betrayed me with Edward's wife.
She breathed once. The last of the sun went behind the hills. The lake went from gold to grey, then to the colour of the darkening sky, and the far shore was gone, and the near water was only a moving darkness beside the turf.
So that is what happened to Mr. March. He betrayed me with the wife of a man of my own blood. That man called him out and shot him for it, then fled that same night to the continent. He has never been brought to account, and likely never will be. And if I could bring him to account now, I would not. I have not said that aloud before either. I went to a boarding house in Bloomsbury with very little left after the scandal and his debts. My parents were gone, and there was no one else of mine I could go to. His people would not hear a word of him, and what remained of mine could not look at me. A woman alone who cannot say why she is alone learns very fast to say nothing at all.
She was not weeping. She had thought she would, if she ever said it aloud. But the tears had come long ago, in the year of silence, over a dropped cup, over the wrong kind of mourning, over nothing anyone else could see. Now there was only the truth itself, spoken plainly in the dark, with the lake lost to sight and Marcus still beside her.
There is one more thing. Not about Thomas, or Edward, or the duel. About what all of it did to me. I knew Thomas was cruel. I knew I had been unhappy. But I had been wrong about how far that cruelty went, and how much I had refused to know. Afterward, I could not trust my own judgment. Then your letters came, and they were the first thing in a very long time that made me wonder whether I might learn to trust it again. Not at once, not easily, but enough to hope.
She fell silent. The lake was entirely dark now. A little light still held in the sky behind the hills, the last of it fading. She kept her eyes on the dark water and did not turn to him. The silence settled after her words. He did not break it. When he spoke, his voice was quiet.
Look at me, please, not at the water. I am here.
She turned her head and looked at him. It was nearly dark, and she could not see his face well, only that he had turned toward her. There was no careful arrangement of sympathy in it, no flinch, no weighing look of the magistrate. He was only looking at her, as he had across the supper table, steadily and without demand.
I am going to say this badly, because I have not said it before, and I have no speech prepared. I can only say it plainly.
The last grey was fading behind the hills.
I have spent many years serving the law for other people, but I am not the law tonight. I am not sitting here as a magistrate, or as the man whose duty it might be to make inquiries about your cousin. I am here as the man who read your letters by candlelight in Hampshire, and was not the same man afterward. Your husband did wrong. That wrong was his, not yours. You did not do it, and you did not cause it by failing to see it. A woman is not answerable for what a man chooses to be when she is not in the room. Your cousin did what the law would name a crime, and then fled beyond its reach. That guilt is his. The failure to pursue him belongs to others. None of it belongs to you. You have been carrying a burden that was never yours to carry. I cannot lift it from you tonight, but I can tell you, as a man who has spent his life weighing guilt and innocence, that you may lay it down. And I would not say that merely to be kind. Iris will tell you so at length if you ask her.
For an instant she almost smiled.
And now the other wound. You said what you carry is not only what he did, but what it made you believe of yourself, that you could no longer trust your own judgment. Not about anyone, not even about me. I heard you, Henrietta.
She did not say anything. The lake was lost in the dark now. She could only hear the low wash of water against the shore below.
This much I know. Your judgment was not broken when you wrote those letters. I read them, Henrietta. I saw the people you noticed, the small truths you hid inside ordinary days, the things you understood when you thought no one was reading closely. That was not the work of a woman who cannot see clearly. It was the work of a woman who sees more truly than most people I have known. You were afraid to trust yourself because one man had taught you not to, but you were wrong about him, not about everything. And you have not been wrong about me. I would stake the rest of my life on that. Indeed, I should like to.
He took her hand then. He did not press it or hold it hard. He simply held it gently. He did not say anything more. The last of the light went out over the water. She did not weep, even then. She only let her hand stay in his. And then, beneath the exhaustion, beneath the shame and the fear and all that had been said, something bright rose in her, sudden and immense. She had no practice in receiving it. It filled her to the edge of pain, warm and strange, and for a moment she could do nothing but sit there with her hand in his and let it come. They walked back along the path in the dark, slowly, because the way was rough and there was no moon yet. At the uneven places he steadied her. They did not speak, and the silence felt companionable. Lady Iris was in the drawing-room, a book open on her lap and the lamp lit beside her. She looked up as they came in out of the dark. Her eyes moved from one face to the other, but whatever she saw there, she kept to herself.
There you are. Supper has been waiting.
She got up, put the book on the chair behind her, and went ahead of them into the dining room, already talking of supper and declaring that Mrs. Aketh would never forgive any of them if the soup had suffered. Outside, the dark lake moved below the windows. Mrs. March went in beside Lord Marcus, with his hand still warm in her memory, and felt the first bright certainty that fear was not the only thing waiting for her. Epilogue. A letter from London. Stoke Abney, Hampshire, in October. The fire was lit early at Stoke Abney now, because the mornings had turned cold. The breakfast room faced east and took what sun there was, and on this particular morning there was a little. There were 3 of them at the table. Lady Iris had come down for the wedding, which had been small and quiet, and only 8 days before. Since then, she had shown no definite intention of going home. Stoke Abney had been her childhood home, and she was happy there among old rooms, old walks, and old friends who had known her before she had learned discretion, if indeed she ever had. She declared that October in Hampshire was worth staying for. Nobody had argued. Henrietta was still getting used to her new wardrobe. That morning, she wore a soft blue muslin gown, newly made, with long sleeves and a narrow ribbon at the waist. Simple enough for breakfast, but finer than anything she had owned in years. She had paused over it before coming down, half inclined to feel foolish in so pretty a thing, and then had worn it anyway. Marcus had made it gently, stubbornly clear that the old gowns belonged to the life she had left. The Morning Post lay before Lord Marcus. He went through it in the way he went through everything, without hurry, putting the bills neatly to one side. Part-way down he stopped at a letter in Lady Sophronia's hand and gave the smallest lift of his brow.
Sophronia,
He said.
Read it aloud.
Said Lady Iris, putting down her cup.
Every word, especially the parts you think it would benefit me not to hear.
He read it in the level, unhurried voice he used for everything, which was the funniest possible voice to read it in. Lady Sophronia's opinions came into the room one after another, fully formed and untouched by tact. She had heard that the wedding had taken place. She would not say she was surprised. This family had long ago exhausted her capacity for surprise. The haste of it would be remarked upon, and by persons she did not name, though their remarks were conveyed in considerable detail. There was nothing now to be done but wish them happy, which she did in a sentence that managed to wish and scold at once. Lady Iris laughed into her tea and had to put the cup down.
For once, I am not in her sights.
not so fast. There is a postscript. Pray tell Lady Iris that Lord Wetherby was asking after her the other day. I told him she would call as soon as she is back in town.
Lady Iris stopped reaching for the toast.
Did you indeed, Sophronia? Lord Wetherby is 70 if he is a day, and still believes himself a danger to ladies.
Henrietta had been smiling at Lady Iris when she noticed the other letter beside her own plate. It had not been addressed to Stoke Abney at all, but to Lady Iris's house in Half Moon Street, and sent on from there with the rest of the post. The direction still called her Mrs. March, in a careful, unfamiliar hand, and for a moment she only looked at the name. She had not been Mrs. March for 8 days. The address belonged to the life she had left, and yet here it was, carried after her into the new one. It was from Mrs. Pike, and it was only a few lines. She had not had a word in some months, she wrote, and had begun to wonder how Mrs. March was. Her former room was let now to a Miss Hartley, who taught music and was very quiet on the stairs, which Mrs. Pike seemed to think Henrietta would want to know. Mrs. Pike hoped no news was good news, but she would be easier for a line, if one could be spared, and remained, as ever, hers. She read it to the end, and then sat with it open in her hand, not reading it.
I'd nearly forgotten Bloomsbury.
Lady Iris looked up from her plate.
Then I shall not mourn it for you. Some places should be allowed to grow small behind us.
Under the table, Lord Marcus took Henrietta's hand and gave it one quiet squeeze before letting go. There had been one other letter in the morning's post, and it had gone to Lady Iris. What Henrietta noticed was that Lady Iris had not read it aloud. She said nothing. Lady Iris read everything aloud. She had read them a milliner's bill in September, as though it were a dispatch from the seat of war. But this one she had read to herself, once quickly and once not quickly, and then, most uncharacteristically, had no remark to make.
Gillingham writes a very clear hand.
Said Lord Marcus, studying the letters before him with elaborate innocence, in the voice he used when he had observed a great deal and meant to say only enough to be provoking.
He will be down at Christmas about the Larches lease. I have asked him to stay a few days. It seemed little enough, the man having ridden through bad weather for us twice already this year.
Lady Iris rolled her eyes at him, but said she had not spent Christmas at Stoke Abney in years and would be delighted to do so. She said this at her usual speed, then reached for her cup. Lord Marcus noticed that the letter had been slipped into her sleeve instead of set back on the cloth with the rest. Henrietta drew a sheet of paper toward her. There was ink on the table, as there always was in this household. She dipped the pen and held it above the paper, and began, "Dear Mrs. Pike," and got no further for the moment, because Lady Iris had decided to be diverting on the subject of attorneys and had a great deal to say. A fire stirred. Someone came in softly to clear the plates. Outside the east window, the field cut the week before lay pale in the early light. A man crossed it with a dog and did not look at the house. The morning went on around the three of them at the table, while the letter lay half begun and the pen still rested in her hand. The end. And so Henrietta and Lady Iris find their way to friendship, to courage, and to the quiet beginnings of something new. If this gentle story stayed with you, another awaits. A marriage apart is ready for you now. A husband returned after years of silence, a wife he no longer knows, and a marriage that must be carefully rebuilt or lost for good. Tap the video on your screen to begin listening. I shall return before long with another romance, unless the post has carried me off with the morning letters.